Chapter 407. When the Dongling army broke out of the mountain, Huang Jinwei was in the Tiger Wolf army camp. He was standing in front of a horse-drinking well. This was the way in and out of the 9-death silkworm that had killed Liang Lian when the eldest miss of the Gongsun family had released the power she had accumulated for many years to form the snowstorm that sealed the camp. At this time, he stood in front of this well and even imagined the scene of that day. That person had charged out of the well and silently appeared in front of Liang Lian. The wind and snow had been used by him, since he had entered and exited from this horse-drinking well. If he entered this well and entered the underground Yin River, he might be able to obtain some useful clues. After his conversation with his teacher that day, Huang Jinwei knew that he had to quickly rely on himself to find some clues about the 9-death silkworm. But today, when he finally confirmed that that person had entered and exited through this well, he hesitated slightly. Su Fanqin had died in the underground Yin River. Bai Shanshui was the grandmaster best at controlling water in the world. Even Su Fanqin was not a match for her. He could not win against Bai Shanshui in the underground Yin River. Maybe this entrance was a bait to lure him or other Chongling cultivators in. He was the head of a bureau, and because of his cultivation method, he was more important to Chongling than Su Fanqin. So he did not fear death, but did not dare to take risks. But at this time, he felt the Peach Valley shake. He sensed the vibrations of the primal energies of the universe that only terrifying sword essences could cause. He did not know it was Zhang Shiwu. He did not even know that Yi Xinhe lived there, but he was sure that something unusual was happening in Chongling today. Thinking of what Mo Shouqing had said to him, his face quickly paled. Such a dense battle of grandmasters was like a fuse that could ignite all of Chongling. He took a deep breath. Then he did not hesitate and stepped into the well ahead. He did not want to pursue great merit. He just did not want to see the bloody storm 3 years before Yuan Wu's ascension. A dragon of dust with a bloody scent that only Xin Xian could smell appeared in his gray eyes. In this moment, he finally made a decision. He retreated into the shadows behind the Qianjun gate, waiting for the arrival of the army in the dust dragon. Huang Jinwei's body sank to the bottom of the well like a rock. When his body entered the embrace of the pitch-black water, a small and thin cultivator also walked through the gloomy water. However, even in the deep water, this cultivator's body instead became entirely red, as if he turned into a piece of burning steel. A secret letter landed in Mo Shouqing's hand on the turret. The dim yellow eyes of this old man, whose hair and beard were as white as ginseng whiskers, immediately shone with a bright crystal light. He took a deep breath, then directly floated down from the corner. At the same time, a sword hum suddenly resounded in the scripture cave of a sword academy. A sword light tore through the air before most people in the sword academy could react. Many people looked up and vaguely saw a cultivator with loose hair standing on the sword light, floating like an immortal. In the eastern suburbs, there was an old mausoleum. No one knew when it was left behind. When a black eagle landed in the grass, the gates of an old mausoleum suddenly opened, and a bone-chilling wind blew out. In the next moment, a black cavalry army surged out from within. Be it the horses or the soldiers on the horses, they were all wearing airtight black armor. The armor was covered with mysterious runes that looked like stars. Even the masks on their faces did not have any openings. This kind of cavalry was a true cavalry. Yet when this cavalry charged out of the old mausoleum, they did not make a sound as they ran. They didn't look like an army of living people at all. Instead, they looked more like an army that had charged out of the ghost hell. The dust dragon gradually dissipated in Sun Xian's eyes. His eyes turned a cold blue. This was an army of thousands, and there were dozens of seal chariots among them. But Sun Xian's gaze held faint disdain as he looked at the center of the army. There was a prison carriage at the center of the army. Inside the carriage, there were multiple silver dragon-trapping ropes used to trap cultivators. They passed through the body of a person in the carriage. The prisoner in the carriage had his head bowed. His body was covered in terrifying wounds, and his original appearance could not be seen. "Do not worry, he will not die." A general whose blue armor was cracked came in front of Xin Xian. Seeing that Shun Xian's gaze was only on the prisoner, he said coldly, "Official Shun." Then he nodded in greeting and said seriously, "Official, please take good care of him. Official, you should know what price the Dongling army paid for him to come here alive." Shun Xian ignored the general's words. He nodded coldly and motioned for the other to send the prisoner into the prison. It was very simple to verify his identity. No one could imitate the remnant sword essence of the former Yin Yang sword master of the Bazin Kendo ground. The sharpness of the sword essence left on his body in battle was enough to make people tremble. Shun Xian did not look at Zhang Shiwu's face. He checked the dragon-trapping ropes in the prison carriage as usual. After confirming that Zhang Shiwu did not have any vital energy left in his body, he had the medical officers and prison officers waiting behind him take the prison carriage in. Seeing Shun Xian's appearance, the leading general's expression grew darker. But at this time, he suddenly sensed something. His blue armor vibrated, and he suddenly turned around. A woman in white robes appeared in the short forest and slowly walked over. There was only one woman in Chongling who liked to wear white robes and dresses, or rather, only one that people would remember. That was the bureau chief of the astrology bureau, Yi Xiling. But this woman was taller than Yi Xiling. Even though he could not see her face from afar, this general felt that her expression was prouder than Yi Xiling, or rather, arrogant. She walked over through the sand, looking at this famous elite army of the Great Qin Empire. It was as if they did not exist at all. By Shanshui, this Qin dynasty general squeezed out the name through gritted teeth. It was at this moment that a shrill sword cry rang out. The Dongling army was one of the elite armies of the Qin dynasty. Before he gave the order, they had prepared to fight. But this Qin dynasty general's heart kept falling. This army had just fought a battle and faced an enemy as strong as Bai Shanshui. Shun Xian's breathing paused slightly. A hint of disdain appeared at the corners of his mouth. He knew his feeling was correct. Sharp sword howls sounded. More than a dozen flying swords sensed great danger and flew out of their sheaths. But in this moment, a glowing drop of water fell from the clouds. This translucent drop of water fell towards one of the 10 flying swords, which had a red jade-like luster. This flying sword's presence was the most stable. In the previous battle, the sword's owner had clearly not been as exhausted as the other swordsmen. The glowing drop of water fell from the sky. But when it landed, the dozen flying swords had just flown overhead. The drop of water fell between the sword lights. It was just a raindrop, but when it fell to the ground, it turned into terrifying thunder. Boom! There was a great explosion. The swordsman was torn apart in a wave of energy. The red, jade-like sword, whose presence had been the most stable a fraction of a second ago, suddenly dimmed and fell with a shrill howl. This was just the tearing of the initial impact. The moment the swordsman's body was torn apart, an enormous wave of water seemed to appear out of thin air and exploded outwards. Sharp howls sounded. Dozens of soldiers were hit by the enormous wave, their bodies flying out, blood spraying from their mouths. Bai Shanshui smiled. A sword light so green it was almost black appeared in front of her. She gripped this sword and casually swung it forward. With a boom, the 2 flying swords that were attacking her were directly bent and sent flying in a disorderly manner. The 2 swordsmen in the army grunted at the same time. They could not stand still and fell to the ground with pale faces. A lot of aquamarine water vapor sprayed out from the aquamarine sword. Waves splashed in the formation of this army. Chapter 408. Sky Pivot. Qi Xian. A shrill military order rang out. Tens of dazzling green beams of light burst out of the formation, which was filled with splashes of water. The bodies of the dozens of swordsmen seemed to be weightless in these blue lights, and immediately landed around Bai Shanshui. Dozens of sword lights of different colors with sharp murderousness lit up the air around Bai Shanshui like crystals. When it comes to fearlessness, there is no other dynasty's army that can compare to your Qin army. Supposedly, when the people of the Bazin Kendo ground fought back then, they were the first to charge fearlessly at the front and formed your style. But in the end, The Bazinkindo ground was destroyed by your own people. In the past, you were a weak Qin, and everyone had to risk their lives to not be destroyed by the enemy. But when the Qin destroyed the 3 dynasties, it was a strong Qin. You risk your lives now. Is it for the Yuanwu emperor or for the Jiaodong commandery woman who stole the fruit of the Bazinkindo ground? Bai Shanshui ignored them. She said with slight disdain as she walked forward. These sword lights that came from all directions seemed to have sealed off all the space around her, but all of them fell behind her. She swung her sword forward. A jade-green sword light shot out from the ground like the tail of a shark, cutting through the entire army. A straight and deep sword mark was left on the ground. In the next moment, there was an astounding sound of water from this sword mark. There was a loud rumble. An enormous white wave formed out of thin air, like an enormous white serpent, moving forward. Bai Shanshui, standing with one hand on her back, was at the top of the wave. As the giant wave moved forward, it was unknown how many fearless Dongling army soldiers were sent flying. Even the heavy seal chariots were like driftwood in the water, drifting to the sides. The dozens of swordsmen behind Bai Shanshui had ugly expressions. Not only did all of their swords miss, but even the power of the waves at the end of the huge wave was not something they could withstand. They could only watch as Bai Shanshui instantly broke through the formation. They could not even buy any time at all. Official Shun, are you still not going to act? The leading blue-armored general looked at the Dongling army that seemed to have been cut in half at the waist. He turned around with an ugly expression. He knew that Bai Shanshui was more terrifying than the rumors said, and the Dongling army could not defeat her at this time. Even if he risked his life to send all his subordinates under Bai Shanshui's sword, there was no meaning. Shen Xian knew what this general of the Dongling army felt right now. But facing this general's request, he shook his head coldly and said, "The Chongling outside does not belong to my jurisdiction. What I need to do is ensure the safety of the great floating water prison, ensure that the prisoners inside are not rescued or die before they are ordered to be executed." Before this Dongling army general in blue armor could get angry, Shen Xian's cold face disappeared in front of him, because the 1,000-Jun gate between him and Shen Xian had fallen. Many gates were called 1,000-Jun gates. But in all of Chongling, and even the entire Qin dynasty, there was no gate as strong as the 1,000-Jun gate of the great floating water prison. So when the door fell, when the dust from the air hit his face, this general of the Dongling monarch did not even have the mood to pull out his sword and slash at the door to vent his anger. Only a bone-piercing coldness filled his heart. Bai Shanshui came over on the waves. He was right in front of Bai Shanshui. This general took a deep breath. A blue life-bond sword appeared in his hand. He gripped this life-bond sword tightly, but his entire hand and body trembled violently, not because of terror and the arrival of death, but because he was certain that even if he died, the Dongling army on the 2 sides of the waves would still charge at Bai Shanshui. They would all die. He only hesitated now. He hesitated if he should give an order for this army to retreat. He would risk his death and the humiliation he would suffer in exchange for the lives of his subordinates. Before the monstrous sword could reach him, his clothes were already soaked. This was a pure difference in cultivation. He could not understand how the water could reach him when his life-bond sword energy was in front of him. He finally made up his mind and prepared to speak. Before he died, he would give the order for this remnant army to retreat. However, it was also at this moment that the majestic sword intent did not directly descend. Bai Shanshui's voice sounded softly in his ear. "Just a moment more. I will not kill your subordinates. You will not stop me." This Dongling army general stilled. He did not understand the meaning of the words, but in this moment, the terrifying sword essence pressed down. Boom! He felt a sharp pain in his eardrums, and an explosion sounded in his mind. His body was sent flying by a powerful force without any resistance. He slammed heavily into the 1,000 cataclysmic gate behind him and was sent flying into the air again. A mist of blood spurted out from the general's mouth. But this general found he was not dead. This blow should have been enough to kill him, but he did not die. Shen Xian slowly walked into the great floating water prison. Behind the Qianjun gate, another horizontal gate had already closed behind him. On the two sides of the tunnel he passed, water seeped out of the stone cracks and gradually covered the stone path he was walking on. The water on the two sides of the stone path inexplicably surged upwards and flashed with silver light. His steps were not fast or slow. The prisoner carriage that had brought Zhang Shiwu and had been sent deep into the great floating water prison. When the Dongling army general hit the Thousand June Gate hard, a bell seemed to ring in the great floating water prison. Waves of sound came and charged into the depths of the great floating water prison. In the depths of the great floating water prison, there was a third door, an invisible door. A transparent arc of light flashed in the darkness and blocked off the sound from the outside. But this arc of light could only block the sound that people could hear and protect the sound that passed inside. It could not stop the sound from spreading to other places like deep underground. In the gloomy underground Ain River, the surging black water, with enormous pressure, seemed to wash away everything in its path. However, in this Ain River, a figure that looked like a red-hot metal rod was silently standing there. When the sound of the collision passed into the ground, there was a strange tremor in the Ain River at the bottom of the earth. This skinny but towering body suddenly moved. It was as if a huge furnace had been erected in the Ain River. An enormous ball of fire forcibly stood tall in the pitch-black Ain River. It grew at a terrifying speed, as if it was going to devour the entire Ain River. The burning fire and steam slapped away all the water. A blinding fire charged towards the hard rock in front of this figure. There was a small opening in the black and hard rock. Occasionally, one or two bubbles would come out. When the flame rushed into the small water hole and came into contact with one or two bubbles, it immediately generated a terrifying force that rushed into the water hole at an unimaginable speed. Countless fiery red cracks appeared on the hard black rock. The cracks continued to extend upwards, and the rock continued to crumble. Red liquid flowed from the cracks of the collapsed rock. This was molten lava. The rock layer continued to collapse upward like a huge mountain collapsing. The fiery red figure passed through the collapsing rock and continued to move upwards. In front of her, when the rock stopped collapsing, there was a flash of metal. Iron pillars as thick as a child's arm blocked her path. Without any hesitation, she went straight through. She was like a gigantic flaming sword, slashing through the black iron pillars. The iron pillars broke. Pew, 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 pew. At the same time, the water under each dark cell in the great floating water prison started to give off strange sounds and bubbles. The fiery red figure continued to move forward. A blinding silver light appeared in front of her. The blinding silver light illuminated her lonely and thin figure. She was naturally Zhao Si of the Zhao Sword Furnace. Chapter 409. The silver light came from a wall in front of her. Actually, it was more appropriate to call it an enormous stele. The environment she was in right now was like an enormous underground cave, and there seemed to be an enormous stele inserted into the center of the cave. It gave people the feeling that this enormous stele was half on the ground and half in the water, right in front of her. This enormous stele was made from a kind of blue-gray metal. There were many deep seal lines on it. The dazzling silver light flowed through the seal lines and then came out. This was an enormous and lifeless stele. Compared to this enormous stele, Zhao Si's figure was like a small fish facing the bottom of an enormous ship. Yet when she looked at the enormous stele, she laughed maniacally. "We meet again," she said to the cold stele. Then she released the vital energy and primal energies of the universe that had accumulated in her body along her meridians. She broke through the rocks. When she reached this place, the water from the depths of the underground river also surged here. In the deep water, there were many even darker lines, black and sticky. When her sword essence was at its fiercest, these black lines suddenly broke out of the water and were all strips of black oil. When the black oil met the astounding primal energies of the universe coming out of her body, it was like a life suddenly encountering what it had been waiting for its entire life. With a boom, the strips of black oil all turned into fire swords. This was an indescribable scene. Countless flaming swords pierced through the water. carrying an aura that could pierce the heavens and destroy the earth as they ruthlessly stabbed into the seal scripts on the giant monolith. Waves of energy exploded on the enormous steel in front of her. Countless splashes of water exploded outwards like extremely fine powder. Countless silver sparks charged out of the seal scripts. The dense silver sparks lit up the entire underground cave like a bright, starry sky. But there was no heat, only a cold and destructive presence. This presence was the presence of Empress Zhengxiu that she was familiar with. Cracks appeared in the seal scripts of the enormous steel. The silver light that flowed like flowing silver water also disappeared. Zhao Xi's presence rippled violently. Blood seeped out of the corner of her mouth, but a proud smile appeared on her lips again. She had only lost to Zhengxiu's sword on the Wei River. However, in the following exchanges between her and Zhengxiu, she won all of them. The sword that the Zhao sword furnace lost will be taken back with their own hands. She looked at the giant monument and said firmly in her heart. When the starlight flowing through the enormous steel dissipated, the invisible starlight that had fallen into the great floating water prison suddenly broke apart. This naturally could not escape the perception of the Empress in the palace. However, there was no anger on her flawless face. Instead, a cold smile appeared on her face. She didn't think there was anything wrong with her prediction. Just like how that person was the most familiar with her, she was also the most familiar with that person. Right now, the 9 Death Silkworm's way of doing things was very similar to that person. That was why she was able to predict the future. Therefore, she didn't care about this temporary victory or defeat. She felt that the net that she pulled in later would capture all of these great rebels in one fell swoop. She even started to imagine how she had met these people in the great floating water prison. As the silver starlight in the seal scripts on the giant monument that Zhao Xi faced dissipated, the silver starlight that flowed through the invisible places of the great floating water prison like a bloodline also disappeared. A wave of strange vibrations and booms sounded in the great floating water prison. Bai Shanshui's white robes fluttered as she stood in front of the Thousand Catty Gate. Behind her, the general who had been sent flying struggled to stand up in the dust. The reorganized army formed a semicircle around Bai Shanshui. But without the general's orders, they did not immediately launch a new wave of attacks. All of these dongling army soldiers did not hear Bai Shanshui's words like the general. But when they looked at Bai Shanshui standing in front of the Thousand Catty Gate, they had a strange feeling. They started to feel that in the next moment, the gate would rise. It was also at this moment that all of them held their breaths. Bai Shanshui laughed. A wave of dust rose from the ground in front of her. The Thousand Catty Gate rose. She stepped forward without hesitation. The slender and beautiful figure, with an indescribable arrogance, passed the Thousand Catty Gate. The strange vibrations and booms came from the entire great floating water prison. All of the great floating water prison was trembling. The inside of the great floating water prison was usually not seen by the people of Chongling, but there were many terrifying officials inside. Feeling the entire great floating water prison tremble, these officials who had been terrifying started to feel terror. But not all of them. Bai Shanshui walked towards the second door. All of a sudden, the water that filled the passageway was pushed outwards like a huge fist that hammered down on the door. Then the door bent and revealed a crack big enough for Bai Shanshui to enter. The turbulent water flowed out from Bai Shanshui's sides, as if it was tamed and flowed away. A wave of water rose on the sand outside the great floating water prison. This usually dry and dusty land was like a beach at this moment. The water in front of Bai Shanshui's passageway disappeared, leaving only uneven rocks. At the end of the passageway, a fearless figure stood there. Bai Shanshui had broken through the Dongling army outside and crossed the Qinjun Gate to come here. Her aura was already at the peak of her life. But the figure in front of her did not show any fear. His aura surged towards her like a tide, as if he was pressuring her instead. This person was not Xinxian. He was an old man dressed in indigo robes. His facial features were very small, but his face was very long, which made his face look like a very flat bamboo board. Looking at the old man, Bai Shanshui laughed and said, Du Qingli, you think you can stop me? The old man's brow imperceptibly furrowed slightly. Maybe people in the world knew that there were two hidden Qin dynasty academicians in the great floating water prison, but very few knew their names, and even fewer could recognize them at a glance. I am not from the Qin, and naturally do not know your name. Before I prepared to enter here, I did not know that you and Du Hongtan existed here. Looking at the old man who did not immediately respond, Bai Shanshui smiled even more happily. You should know who told me. I can tell you clearly that he will not come out today. We have the ability to enter here. You should know his abilities. Even if we fail today, you will not escape his revenge. As the entire great floating water prison trembled, this old man, who had not lost in presence even when facing Bai Shanshui at her peak, suddenly felt a thread of terror. 9-death silkworm. He knew what Bai Shanshui meant by him, and instinctively spoke. This was the chance Bai Shanshui had been waiting for. Bai Shanshui attacked. The green longsword in her hand disappeared. A green wave rippled in front of the old man's brow. A green needle appeared at the center of the green wave. This is the 9-death silkworm. But you cannot even win against me. Why fear the 9-death silkworm's revenge? At this time, Bai Shanshui's disdainful voice sounded. The pupils of the old imperial academician contracted. He sensed the sword essence in the needle. Ignoring Bai Shanshui's response, he shouted harshly, "The heir to the 9-death silkworm told you to target me like this." Before he shouted the first word, a slender green sword light lit up in his hand like a thin bamboo branch. It did not fall directly towards Bai Shanshui's sword essence, but toward his left brow. There was a soft hiss. Bai Shanshui's sword essence inexplicably disappeared. A wound appeared on his left brow. Blood flowed down and covered his already small left eye. The harsh shout shook the passageway. Bai Shanshui attacked a second time. Her life-bond sword appeared in her hand again. In this moment, 17 green water droplets appeared in front of her life-bond sword. The 17 green water droplets sped up and elongated. Chapter 410. This old academician and Bai Shanshui were not ordinary Realm 7s. Just now, in order to block Bai Shanshui's attack, Du Qingli had been swept by her sword essence. There was only a wound on his left eyebrow, but the sword essence had entered his brain and caused serious injuries to him. At this time, he had lost control of many parts of his body. But he was a true grandmaster, a grandmaster who had survived those years of fighting in Chongling. Facing Bai Shanshui's 17 green water droplets that had formed into swords, his black pupils quickly faded to gray. Gray energy visible to the naked eye flowed out of the cracks in the black rock above his head and into his body. His body did not change, but he gave people the feeling that he was expanding. The 17 jade-green water droplets had just formed into small swords when they suddenly shattered. They fell to the ground like scattered sand. Bai Shanshui took a step back. Countless rocks under her feet cracked soundlessly, the cracks spreading outwards like a huge spider web. Du Qingli's face was covered in blood, but his expression was strangely calm. He had cultivated in this great floating water prison for many years. From a certain point of view, this was his world. He did not believe he was not a match for this junior. Bai Shanshui frowned deeply. A sparkling and completely colorless water droplet silently appeared in front of her. However, it floated in the air without moving, as if it didn't know how it could truly pose a threat to this old consecrator. Just as Bai Shanshui was stopped by Du Qingli, the water level in the cave where Zhao Si was located started to fall. The Yin water that had surged up due to the temporary water pressure started to fall back. The truth was out. In Zhao Si's sight, an old man was standing on a rock protruding like an eagle's beak on the opposite wall. An old man who was also dressed in indigo robes. His features were small, but his face was long. Facing Zhao Si right now, this old man who was looking down at her did not have a weak presence, and was even slightly stronger. So he was naturally the other imperial academician who had been guarding this place, Du Hongtan. The Du brothers had been the best young geniuses in Chongling a long time ago. Few people could match their cultivation speed, But the two brothers had completely different personalities. Du Hongtan's temperament was more direct and straightforward. Looking at Zhao Si, who was floating down with the water, he said rudely, "Child, this is Chongling. This is the most heavily guarded prison in Chongling, and also our home. Is this a place you should come to?" After the water fell, there was air. However, at this moment, Zhao Si stood in the air. Steam rose from under her feet, like a cloud supporting her petite but powerful body. In Du Hongtan's voice, she rose instead. "If you didn't enter Zhao, why would I come here?" She looked straight at Du Hongtan and said righteously without anger, "It was you who entered my house first." Du Hongtan shook her head in disdain and said, "No matter what, we're in my house now." His words were rude and unreasonable. But he called Zhao Si, someone who could represent the Zhao sword furnace, a child. This was rude and unreasonable to the extreme. It is rude not to greet. If you cannot talk, you can only use the sword to resolve it. Zhao Si had risen to Du Hongtan's height, but when she said this, she was still going up. Her life-bond sword had been destroyed in the Battle of the Wei River, but the rebirth of adversity allowed her to see a new world. A burning sword essence surged out of her body as she attacked. A red line appeared at the bottom of the enormous steel in front of her. Then this enormous steel, weighing tens of thousands of kilograms, broke. Light appeared in the seal lines of the enormous steel again, but what flowed was not cold starfire, but red flames like hot lava. The entire steel started to boil and turn red. The giant monument became her sword and smashed towards Du Hongtan, who was on the opposite side of her. Du Hongtan was rude and unreasonable to her. Her response right now was even more rude. Seeing such an enormous sword smash over, Du Hongtan's expression grew solemn. At the same time, he sighed sincerely. The cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace are all rare geniuses. Just now, the moment you break this formation and resist the starfire, you can sense the seal lines. Also, only the cultivators of the Zhao sword furnace have such boldness to use such a sword. As he spoke, the enormous steel sword was in front of him. The enormous steel was completely red, so red that it seemed like it would melt at any moment. The extremely high temperature caused his hair to instantly dry up and burn. But he just reached out with his hand. As he reached out, black energy fell down from the cracks in the rock like black sand and landed on the back of his hand. He placed his hand on the red-hot giant monument. Waves of screeching came from inside the enormous steel like metal ships rubbing against each other. The entire monolith suddenly stopped moving. Du Hongtan's body did not even sway. His body was extremely small compared to the enormous steel, but the stone under his feet did not decrease at all, because it was the black energy coming out of his hand that bore all of the power. In the cracks in the rock above, the black sand continued to fall, bearing the brute blow of the Zhao sword furnace. Zhao Si stood with her hands behind her back. The middle and index fingers of her right hand pointed at the enormous steel like a sword. The enormous steel slashed down like a sword. Her body was above the steel, and she used all of her power and the weight of the enormous steel to press down on Du Hongtan. Du Hongtan blocked such a blow so easily. Her brow furrowed deeply, and she sneered. I had not expected that the academician of the Chongling Imperial Palace does not cultivate the sword, but ghostly methods. Hearing her disdainful voice, Du Hongtan just shook his head and laughed. He said, "Child, do not forget when I became famous, Yuan Wu and that person had not been born. In our time, when was Chongling just the world of swordsmen?" Zhao Si did not argue. She remembered this was the truth. She had used all of her power, and it was difficult for her to speak. But Du Hongtan was still relaxed. He looked sympathetically at Zhao Si, who was at her limit, and said, "Since the previous dynasty, the great floating water prison has existed. Many powerful cultivators died here with grievances. In terms of cultivating the so-called ghostly arts, what is more suitable than this place in Chongling? From the start, I reminded you that this is the great floating water prison. This is my home. As long as I am here, I am at my strongest. You have used up much of your energy to break the steel. How can you defeat me now? More black sand fell. The enormous steel gradually rose and pressed down on Zhao Si. The Dongling army started to form up outside the great floating water prison. The leading general thought of by Shan Shui's boldness and words, and his expression was uncertain. Footsteps sounded in the deepest part of the water prison. Shen Xian appeared in the deepest water prison. Seeing him appear, Lin Zhujiu, who was like a rotten lotus leaf in the center of the water prison, laughed. You understand my meaning now? He looked at Shen Xian, who was still expressionless, and said with a smile, Bai Shan Shui may not be able to defeat Du Qingli, and Zhao Si is not a match for Du Hongtan. I do not know why you are laughing so happily. Shen Xian looked at the smiling Lin Zhujiu and said coldly. Lin Zhujiu's smile did not fade. He said, I am laughing because you made a good choice. There is no choice. Shen Xian bowed his head and said coldly with a powerful presence, if you want to laugh outside, you have to at least defeat those 2 academicians. At least, you have to defeat me. His words were hard to understand. However, at this moment, a strange aura was emitted from a cell very close to this place. It was a very strong aura with an indestructible will. In that cell was Zhang Shiwu, who had just been sent in and was on the verge of death. The people in the great floating water prison would not let the dying die, but they would not let the dying have a stronger chance of survival, especially grandmasters above Realm 7. He was a grandmaster who was more powerful than ordinary grandmasters. Yet at this time, the presence coming out of the cell caused many people in the great floating water prison to feel terror and unease. Shen Xian's expression did not change. This seemed to be something that should have happened. Chapter 411. 2 prison wardens in blue official robes appeared in front of the cell immediately. Before the door of the cell was opened, 2 flying swords of different colors had already flown in through the small ventilation window and stabbed at Zhang Shiwu on the stone bed in the cell, like lightning. Zhang Shiwu lay on the stone bed. His energy, had been pierced and bound by special seal chains, and even his body was pierced by steel wires. He could not even commit suicide. But at this time, the surface of his body seemed to be burning. Red waves of energy surged out like red roses blooming. Facing the 2 small swords that flew in through the window, Zhang Shiwu smiled and did not move. But to the shock of the 2 prison officials, the 2 flying swords inexplicably stopped in the air and were unable to advance. Only now did the 2 prison officials remember that there was a sword manual in the world called the Thought Sword. Just like the Heart Thought Sword that the Xian of Mind Chamber sect had used in the Min Mountain Sword Trials. This kind of swordsman cultivated the mind. When they lost control of their bodies, their extraordinary willpower and mental power could gather the primal energies of the universe and turn them into powerful sword essences. In the next moment, the 2 prison officials vomited blood. They lost their connection with their 2 flying swords. The 2 flying swords, shrouded in red waves of energy, crossed together like a pair of scissors. With multiple cracking sounds, the dragon-trapping chains in Zhang Shiwu's energy were cut. When these metal chains were pulled out of his body, blood flowed out along the wounds. In the next moment, soft hissing sounds came from Zhang Shiwu's body. The steel wires that had pierced deeply into his body followed his meridians and blocked the flow of his vital energy, charged out of his body, and floated in the air around him like dancing willows. Zhang Shiwu smiled and sat up. All the blood that flowed out of his body strangely merged with the primal energies of the universe that were gathered by his will. Like many red ribbons, they shot out. With a boom, there was a shock. The heavy iron door was sent flying outwards from the impact. 2 prison wardens who were unable to dodge in time, as well as 5 or 6 prison wardens who came after them, were sent flying by the profound iron door amidst their screams. The red ribbon flew like a living creature, crossing 100 feet and landing on Lin Zhujiu's body in the deepest part of the water prison. Shen Xian remained motionless. These red ribbons of energy and blood flew past him, forming a strange and beautiful scene. When the first red ribbon fell into Lin Zhujiu's body, Lin Zhujiu's decaying body gave off a fresh presence. Blood sacrifice. Even the Bazinkindo ground managed to find such a technique. Those people hiding in the dark must have put in a lot of effort to save you. Shen Xian looked at Lin Zhujiu, who was starting to be reborn in the water, and sneered. That means I haven't failed as a person. Lin Zhujiu laughed. His body floated up from the water. The seal weapons binding his body, including the steel wires and gold chains buried in his body, were all squeezed out of his body. These steel wires and thin ropes, after leaving his body, did not fall like Zhang Shiwu's. Instead, they flew in front of him and started to weave and intertwine in a terrifying way into the shape of a sword. Shen Xian's brow furrowed deeply. The sword that formed in front of Lin Zhujiu gave off powerful life-bond presence, and even an indescribable presence of flesh and blood. He started to realize, in the past years, these things had imprisoned everything in Lin Zhujiu's body, but everything in Lin Zhujiu's body was also nurturing and tempering these things. This was a sword that Lin Zhujiu had used more than a decade to nurture with his energy and his flesh and blood. When the sword was formed, before it drank the blood of the enemy, it was at its fiercest. These steel wires and thin chains grew more condensed in front of Lin Zhujiu, and no cracks could be seen. A crimson longsword was formed, filling the room with crimson light. Shen Xian's expression changed. The glowing water droplet floated silently in front of Bai Shanshui, vibrating but not moving forward. Du Qingli looked at Bai Shanshui with one eye, the power in his eyes growing. But at this time, Bai Shanshui stood with her hands behind her back and smiled at him. Do you know? In reality, I do not need to fight with you. Du Qingli's mind was still in shock. He stilled and could not understand the meaning of the words. I only need to hold you here. Bai Shanshui said coolly. That is enough. Du Qingli didn't think what she said made sense, but he had an inexplicable ominous premonition. So he had to fight. In a flash, the primal energies of the universe he had accumulated for many years in his body erupted. It was as if an invisible giant had appeared in the space between him and Bai Shanshui, and it fiercely blasted a circle forward. A visible shockwave charged at Bai Shanshui at terrifying speed. Bai Shanshui did not move. That glowing water droplet started to change into countless water droplets, and then into countless bubbles that wrapped around Bai Shanshui in layers. The shockwave hit the layers of bubbles. The layers of power disappeared in the gaps between each layer of bubbles, but these glowing bubbles did not break at all. The power in Du Qingli's one eye turned to shock. Cloud Water Palace's sword essence is the strongest in its softest form. Bai Shanshui stood in the glowing bubbles and seemed to be looking at him from across countless worlds as she said coolly. Du Qingli's body quickly turned cold. He found that he and most of the cultivators in Chongling had made a serious mistake. What they had seen before was Bai Shanshui's toughest side, and not her softest side. You are still not retreating? Du Hongtan looked sympathetically at Zhao Si. The enormous steel that was slashing at him, like an enormous sword, was slowly tilting up. Black sand flowed into the back of his hand like a waterfall, and then turned into black energy that flowed out of his palm and landed on the enormous steel. His hand seemed to be glued to the enormous steel. His entire body was moving upwards. The enormous steel gradually tilted up, and its weight naturally pressed toward Zhao Si's side. In his view, when the entire weight of the steel pressed down on Zhao Si would not be able to withstand it, and his body would likely explode into countless pieces. While I hope that you can continue to persist and die here, are you really going to do this? With clear sympathy, he looked at the silent Zhao Si and continued to speak. Zhao Si still did not respond. Du Hongtan suddenly turned his head, because at this moment he felt an extremely dangerous aura. The moment he turned his head, some of the black sand-like energy behind him suddenly condensed into multiple stalks of black bamboo, and then bloomed with deep red flowers. Du Hongtan's expression changed dramatically. His hand quickly left the enormous steel and slapped backwards. There was an explosion. A burst of black energy came out of the void behind him and immediately spread dozens of feet. A quiet woman in a crimson robe appeared from the black smoke. She hugged her zither and slowly looked up. Blood seeped out of the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were completely black, and frighteningly black energy flowed out. Eldest Miss Shang? Du Hongtan was even more disbelieving and said in shock. The quiet woman did not respond. Her hand moved on the zither. Multiple black strings flew up and then disappeared into the air. Du Hongtan let out a furious roar, and the falling black sand began to swirl around his body. Multiple stalks of black bamboo tenaciously grew out of the black sand. Zhao Si narrowed her eyes slightly. Two of her fingers left the enormous steel and then clenched in the air. The enormous steel suddenly burned, turning into liquid metal that splashed into the swirling black sand. White smoke came out. Du Hongtan's shout sounded. Zhao Si continued to move forward. When the enormous steel disappeared, red light flashed inside. There was iron marrow that formed a small burning sword. The Zhao sword furnace was best at forging swords. Zhao Si's hand gripped this newly forged sword and stabbed into the black sand in front of her. Du Hongtan's breathing stopped completely. This was his home. It was where he was the most powerful. However, to Miss Shang, this was also where she was the most powerful. Zhao Si's sword that burned like a bloody sun was a natural counter to dark and gloomy ghost energy. So he could not stop it. He could not be a match for these two working together. He could only watch helplessly as the small sword pierced into his body. Phew! His body was pierced by this small sword. In the next moment, his entire body started to burn. Chapter 412. For Realm 7 cultivators, all the battles that occurred in this prison were not far away. All the Realm 7 grandmasters sensed Du Hongtan's death. Du Qingli's breathing sped up. He looked at Bai Shanshui in the ripples and shouted, "Do not think you can leave here in the end. I know." But his shout was interrupted by Shanshui's calm voice. When the Starfire seal is destroyed, some replacement mechanisms and seal weapons will take its place, and many restrictions will be activated again. However, we still have half a cup of tea's time. Don't forget that there is someone who knows this prison better than all of you. Du Qingli stopped speaking. He felt inexplicably panicked. The deep red sword was filled with terrifying fiendish energy that tore at the dark energy in the prison. Have you thought about the price you will pay? Lin Zhujiu stood on the boiling water. Deep red light gathered on his face like a deep red mask, eerie and beautiful. Shun Xian did not speak. An enormous sword shadow appeared in the dark water below Lin Zhujiu. A terrifying sword essence broke through the water as Shun Xian reached out and poured upwards like it was cutting the sky. Lin Zhujiu attacked. A deep red and eerie sword light flashed, and all the water below him disappeared. Shun Xian's body flew backwards along the corridor behind him. In a flash, he was blown back to an unknown place. An arm was left in the air in front of Lin Zhujiu. This arm stayed in the air for a breath before turning to bloody mist that was absorbed into Lin Zhujiu's sword. Sacrificing an arm for my sword? Isn't that a little too small of a price? Lin Zhujiu did not seem satisfied after cutting off the arm of Shun Xian, whom many people in Chongling feared, with one blow. He shook his head and swung his sword at the wall leading to the cell next to him. The extremely thick black iron wall was cut open like paper. He passed through. In the center of the water prison, there was a cultivator who appeared very young compared to him. This cultivator was Li Yunrui, who Shun Xian could not do anything to. Lin Zhujiu swung his sword and easily cut off everything that had stabbed into Li Yunrui's body. He helped him up and then walked to the third cell. After cutting open the wall again, the deep red sword in his hand scattered like it was returning to its sheath, splitting into many streams and returning to his body. Then he helped Zhang Shiwu up. He nodded to Zhang Shiwu, who was too excited and moved to speak, and said, "Let's go." When Shun Xian's sword energy turned into wind and erupted from the depths of the great floating water prison, it meant that the time had come. Bai Shanshui smiled faintly and said seriously to Du Qingli, "Even a disciple is like this." The destruction of the 3 dynasties in the past is not unjust. As she said this, her body seemed to be as light as a feather as she was blown out of the tunnel by the wind. Du Qingli didn't make a move. Bai Shanshui's soft bubbles were still there. His sword intent could not break through them. The other most important reason was that Bai Shanshui's words made him feel even more terrified. He also understood how terrifying that person had been back then. That person's plans were interconnected and never failed. Bai Shanshui's body flew out of the prison. The layers of glowing bubbles reflected rainbows under the sunlight, beautiful to the extreme. A strange emotion appeared in the eyes of the leading Dongling army general, but he did not hesitate in his order. In a flash, sharp energies broke through the air. Sword lights and cold metal lights hit the glowing bubbles around Bai Shanshui. However, a series of gasps of disbelief could be heard. These swords, seal weapons, and arrows were still unable to penetrate the glowing water bubble. Instead, they pushed the glowing water bubble into the air. The glowing rainbow-colored bubbles turned into transparent water droplets in their sight. Rain began to fall. In the dense rain, Bai Shanshui's voice was lost. Only a joyful and indulgent song reached their ears. My generation likes to learn the sword. 10 years in the cold pool, many cultivators in the Dongling army who were controlling their flying swords lost their target. They looked dazedly at the splashes on the damaged armor of the general in front of them. They looked at the waves created by their flying swords flying through the air and quickly sank into silence. While they were enemies, they could not help but admire Bai Shanshui's heroism. In their impression, there had been many heroic and hot-blooded cultivators in Chongling in the past. Yet as those people disappeared, these heroic and hot-blooded cultivators seemed to have disappeared, or rather, were not on their side. Mo Shouqing's figure moved with the wind. His aged figure was like a stone thrown from a catapult on a turret. He was thrown from one turret to another, passing through the city in a straight line. At this time, he looked up. He was still some distance away from the great floating water prison. At least, he could not pose any threat to Bai Shanshui and the others. Yet he had sensed Bai Shanshui's departure. He was a step too late. Last time, he had been late because he did not know where Bai Shanshui would attack. But now, the Empress in the palace had predicted something like this would happen in the great floating water prison. How could he be late? His brow furrowed deeply. He could not understand. Even more incomprehensible than Mo Shouqing was the black cavalry that had charged out of the old tombs in the eastern suburbs of Chongling. This black cavalry, both the horses and the soldiers on them, wore black armor. The surface of the armor was covered in profound seal scripts like stars. Even the masks had invisible vents. This person and horse were extremely heavy, but their hooves did not touch the ground as they ran. They also rode the wind. This meant that every soldier on the horse was a cultivator and of high cultivation. They were like an army that had just charged out of the ghost hell. This army was indisputably the strongest army of the Qin dynasty. However, this seemingly unstoppable army came to a halt with a wave of the hand of the general at the very front. This general, who had been keeping his head down, looked up. The profound armor on his body was also black, but the mask on his face was made of platinum, which made him look exceptionally cold and eerie. The 2 swords on his back exuded an extremely cold, killing intent at this moment. On the mountain path ahead, within the inexplicable clouds, a cry of disbelief rang out. "General Bai? Guidanshan?" This general spoke in an emotionless voice. A cultivator with long hair, standing on a sword light, flew out of the mist. He looked in disbelief at this general and the strongest army of the Qin dynasty that could kill him many times. He said, "What is going on?" A huge army moved in the wilderness as if they were a single entity. This army had the aura of a tiger and wolf. Half of them were the tiger and wolf army that Liang Lian had previously led, and the other half were the southern tiger and wolf army led by General Xiejuyan. General Liang Lian had been assassinated. This was a hard-to-wash-away humiliation for all of the Qin dynasty's armies, especially the tiger and wolf army. So this army was in a hurry. They wanted to reach the great floating water prison as soon as possible to complete the ambush. Yet when Guidongshan, who should have been heading towards the great floating water prison, stopped the god-killing army, everyone in the northern tiger wolf army showed anger and despair in their eyes. They saw a familiar storm and then felt a bone-piercing cold. At the end of summer, autumn was about to arrive. What welcomed them was a snowstorm that had once swept through the tiger and wolf army. An iron-like figure let out a shrill howl. This general was Xie Juyin. He wore soft black leather armor and a long black cloak behind him. When he forced his way through the storm, his black leather armor and black cloak were completely covered in ice. This general's feet shook, and the ice cracked and fell to the ground. But when he looked around, Zhangsun Qinxue was long gone. Chapter 413. The God-killing army was the strongest army of the Qin dynasty. The leader, General Bai Qi, might not be the general with the highest individual cultivation and combat power, but when he was together with the army behind him, he was the strongest general of the Qin dynasty. Sensing the surprise of this realm, 7 grandmaster in front of him, his killing intent rippled. He looked in the direction of the great floating water prison and felt a hint of bewilderment. The Empress had never had a problem in her countless battles in the past. Was it because she had not been on the battlefield for too long that a problem occurred? At this time, there were many people in Chongling who were bewildered. Mo Shouqing also stopped. A few strands of his white hair fell behind him, but he did not detect it. However, the wrinkles on his forehead and the corners of his eyes had quietly deepened by a few more wrinkles. He understood the Empress better than this general who only knew to kill. He knew the Empress would not have a problem. Since the Empress would not have a problem, then the problem would only be with the 9-death silkworm. Ever since the 9-death silkworm officially appeared and announced his existence to Chongling and the entire world, he had been winning in his battles with the Empress. The Empress could not find him, but the people around the Empress were decreasing. For someone like Mo Shouqing, this was a very dangerous signal. This meant even if it was just an heir, after seeing the Empress clearly in a fair battle, the heir of the 9-death silkworm could still win against the Empress. So he was not just worried the Empress would go crazy. He was worried the Empress would not be a match for the 9-death silkworm in the future. He was one of the wisest people in Chongling. He knew there was no meaning in thinking about the distant future. Yet when he thought of the unpredictable fate of a dynasty that was already so powerful and had its people living and working in peace, he still gave a painful groan inside. For the Empress, the change in the great floating water prison was something she had expected. But for all of Chongling, the change in the great floating water prison was a sudden accident. The people of the Divinity Bureau did not know. The people of the Astrology Bureau did not know. Yi Sealing's carriage was heading towards Skyfall Alley. There may be a spy from the Yin dynasty hiding there. Chief Inspector Chun was reviewing files in the Astrology Bureau. The Empress stood in front of the Spirit Lotus Pond and waited patiently. A faint smile appeared on her perfect face. It was a rare and cruel smile. In her plan, today, the Bazin Kendo ground, or rather, the remnants of that person's army would disappear, and from their bodies, it was possible to find the traces of the 9-death silkworm. If the 9-death silkworm did not disappear, she would not be able to eat or sleep in peace. The Yuanwu Emperor had used the pressure of the Deer Mountain Conference to reach Realm 8. The vibration at this time could not be another breakthrough. So Huang Jinwei's emotions were turbulent. He could not imagine what had happened to cause Emperor Yuanwu, who was cultivating in seclusion, to have such strong emotions. But he felt a sense of foreboding. A faint chill appeared in the quiet medical center. Ding Ning, who had been sitting on the bed and looking out the window, smiled. His smile contained an indescribable emotion. He looked at Zhangsun Qinxue, who pushed open the door and walked in. He looked deeply, as though he wanted to merge her into his sight. Zhangsun Qinxue turned her head and did not look at Ding Ning's face. She said coldly, "When do you plan to see Lin Zhujiu?" Ding Ning looked at her and slowly said, "When I ensure that all of us are safe." In the Imperial Palace, the Empress pushed open the half-closed door to the Imperial study. She walked in and looked at the Yuanwu Emperor, standing in front of the enormous map. She said coldly, "This is not a fair battle. Any dissatisfaction towards the Qin dynasty and Chongling, even past dissatisfaction, will be placed on us." The Yuanwu emperor looked calmly at her and did not speak. The empress looked at him and said, "Last time, you told me to wait and see. I listened to you. But now, I do not want to wait." She paused and then said, "If we cannot kill all the enemies, then we will be cruel to the end and grasp everything in our hands." The Yuanwu emperor smiled. "No matter what you decide," he said softly, "I will stand by your side in the end. Otherwise, why would I look at this map now?" The empress looked at his peaceful face, and her heart was slightly moved at this moment. She knew that this powerful man had done enough for her, but this feeling was only for a moment. She also knew that many times she was just a mistress. Then the evil deeds of the family were all done by her. At least, most people in Chongling thought that the Yuanwu emperor only focused on cultivation and did not care about court matters. Even more importantly, she did not feel true joy. Without true joy, how could one obtain joy from a person? She looked at the Yuanwu emperor and smiled. Her smile was enchanting and perfect. So beautiful it was intoxicating. Then she turned and left. The Yuanwu emperor looked at her beautiful back and could not calm his heart. "Make the ghost market disappear," she said to the two palace attendants behind her as she walked to her study. Chapter 414. An army that seemed to have come out of hell reached the great floating water prison. With a boom, when this army stopped, this army seemed to have finally become an army of the human world. The hooves of the horses struck the ground, producing a uniform roar. Bai Qi, the commander of the god-killing army, with his two swords crossed on his back, felt the murderousness in this part of the world. His gaze hidden in the platinum mask grew murderous. No one knew his origins. They only knew that the Qin dynasty's god-killing army only had one goal: to kill that person. Every soldier of the god-killing army, supposedly, had undergone unimaginable death training. They were all gods of killing chosen from the 100 of Jiaodong commandery. The so-called 1 in 100 meant that the other 99 people had died in the process of elimination. The only one left was most likely more terrifying than the 99 people of the past added together. A commander who could command an army like this was naturally a god of killing. So today, just by breathing the air under the sun, this commander wearing the platinum mask seemed to smell the murderousness in Chongling. A black eagle descended from the sky, bringing with it a new military order. Without any words, after reading the latest military order, this commander with eyes overflowing with killing intent turned his horse around, the entire army following behind him like ghosts. The army moved through the countryside. The cavalry passed through the fields. The crops swayed in the wind, but did not break. These cavalry seemed to be weightless in the wind. There was a child crying in the farmhouse, but a farmer woman who was busy with her loom didn't have time to care. Suddenly, the child's crying stopped. The farmer woman turned around in surprise, only to see a scene that she would never forget for the rest of her life. An unimaginably cold army was marching in the wind, passing by her window. Fish market was cold in the day and bustling at night. This army moved too quickly. Or rather, the people of Fish Market were like ghosts wandering outside Chongling. Under the cover of the thick canopies, they did not care about the wind and rain outside. So when this army came to the river port outside Fish Market was cold and cheerless. No one paid attention to the arrival of this army. The leader of the god-killing army, Bai Qi, stopped. The moment he stopped, he didn't make any extra movements. However, a deputy general behind him already rode out. Then his cold voice sounded under the canopy of Fish Market. "Imperial order! Retreat!" He only said a total of 5 words, and only said it once. However, the echoes continued to reverberate, as if countless dangerous voices of generals were constantly shouting out. The entire Fish Market began to shake. It was as if many wasps had suddenly flooded into an ordinary beehive. Several people under the nearest canopy appeared in the sunlight. A middle-aged scholar who was dressed like a private school teacher, But his face was too pale, raised his head to look at this army, slowly saying, "Even if we are going to withdraw, how long will it take?" At this moment, the deputy general at the front glanced at this teacher and said, "It's not about time, it's about attitude." This teacher-like middle-aged scholar understood the meaning behind these words, his heart suddenly going cold. However, the 2 or 3 people behind him still didn't understand, loudly shouting, "What do you all mean by this? You are forcing us to leave here. Could it be that you don't want to give us time to move? Also, if we leave here, where will we settle down?" The deputy general slowly looked up at the people who had spoken and said, "A place that should not exist in the first place needs to be settled down. Wandering souls and wild ghosts should go wherever they are meant to go. What if we do not leave?" A cold laugh sounded from the shadows of the canopy. The deputy general's voice did not change, but everyone sensed cold, killing intent in the air. "You dare to defy the imperial order? You already said we are wandering ghosts. What do you dare or not dare?" The person in the shadows sneered. "Die!" An unusually simple cold shout sounded. When this voice sounded, this deputy general and his horse had already passed over the heads of the teacher-like middle-aged scholar and others, landing in the canopy behind them. With a tearing sound, a black bolt of lightning tore through the canopy under the horse. A ghostly figure under the canopy was lifted up without any resistance. The horse under him neighed, turned around, and jumped back into the air like it was flying. The weapon in his hand that looked like a bolt of black lightning was a long spear. At this time, the ghostly figure under the canopy was pierced through by his spear and lifted up. The moment his horse landed, the figure that had been lifted out of the canopy by his spear was thrown heavily onto the river port at the side. Blood surged out of that person's body. This deputy general wearing a black mask pointed his spear forward, blood dripping off the tip of the black spear. This scene was enough to shock people in most places, and even the general of a small city. But this was Fish Market, a place for many wandering ghosts, and even fugitives and criminals who needed to rely on this place to hide just now. This deputy general's spear only pierced through one canopy, but in this moment, 5 or 6 more canopies were broken. 5 flying swords flew towards this deputy general at the same time. Killing the chicken to warn the monkey, this was a move that everyone would use. For the people of Fish Market, this deputy general directly assassinating a person who had disobeyed was killing the chicken to warn the monkey. For them, as long as they could return the favor and kill this deputy general, it would also be killing the chicken to warn the monkey. 5 flying swords appearing in an instant was something unimaginable in other places. This was also the true reason that outside powers could not insert themselves into Ghost Market. But they did not know what kind of army this was. They did not know that even if they could kill this deputy general, this army's killing intent and determination would not change. Moreover, in front of such an army, they could not kill any of the deputy generals. Seeing the 5 flying swords coming at him through the canopy, this deputy general did not even change his posture as he held his spear. The 2 horses behind him moved. Another deputy general came to his side. This deputy general also had 2 swords on his back, but compared to Bai Chi, these 2 swords were very short. But when this deputy general pulled out these 2 swords, the sound of the swords rubbing against the scabbards rang out. Several gasps of shock sounded. This deputy general's 2 swords were like 2 long whips that seemed to be usually folded in the scabbards. When he pulled out, the swords swam out like vipers. The shape of the swords was like the body of a viper. Not only were they slightly round, they were covered in scale-like barbs. This deputy general pulled out his swords. With just one swing from both hands, there were countless snake shadows in the air. Ding, 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 ding. The sound of metal hitting metal rang out. The 5 flying swords were all locked in place by the barbs of these 2 strange swords. These 5 flying swords struggled fiercely. The enormous power was not something that this deputy general could contend against, and he was about to be pulled off his horse. But this deputy general's 2 swords only needed to trap these 5 flying swords for a moment. The other deputy general, who came out of the crowd, had already attacked. The metal plates on his arm pulsed like water, forming a black longbow in his hand. For arrow lights broke through the air. His 4 arrows were all very unique talisman arrows. The arrowhead and tail feathers were made of cold black steel, but the arrowhead tips were made of deep red gems. These 4 arrow lights were faster than the flying swords of most cultivators in Chongling. There were only 4 arrow lights, and with a few popping sounds, the dark canopy was filled with a rain of blood. The 5 fiercely struggling flying swords immediately lost their vitality and fell to the ground. 4 arrows had killed 5 cultivators who could already control flying swords. There was no sound from Fish Market. Only many canopies shook like ripples, spreading backwards. Everyone finally understood the true strength of this legendary god-killing army. Everyone began to understand that the strength of this army simply couldn't be measured by the strength of an ordinary army. The spear-wielding deputy general at the front did not care about the people in front of him who had left Fish Market. He moved his horse forward again. The warhorse was still moving in the wind like a guest from the underworld. The black spear in his hand flicked casually. With each flick, a canopy would fly up towards the river port on the side. No one dared to stop him. This army drove straight into Fish Market. On a turret closest to Fish Market, Huang Jinwei saw his teacher, Emo Shoching. When he saw this old man again, Huang Jinwei did not dare to believe his eyes. He sensed that this old man had aged extremely quickly. What aged was not his appearance, but his spirit. Looking at Fish Market in his sight, Huang Jinwei's lips trembled. "Teacher, the madness has started." Emo Shoching turned his head and gave him a bitter smile. He said softly, "At this time, you cannot stop anything. You only have the right to choose which side to stand on." Chapter 415. Under the night sky, a silver ribbon-like stream flowed on the boundless grassland. This stream was the natural border between the Qin dynasty and Wuji. On one end was the grassland kingdom of Wuji, and on the other was the border city of the Qin dynasty. A wooden bucket slowly floated down from the upper stream. A well-built man with a shaved head and a long beard casually grabbed the wooden bucket that floated over. Although the wooden bucket was old, it was very clean. He casually picked up some water and gave it to a gray-white horse behind him to drink. Footsteps were heard in the grass. The bearded man looked in the direction of the sound, his thick eyebrows slowly raised provocatively. A smear of darkness heavier than the night appeared in his eyes. It was a Qin dynasty border soldier who was much shorter than him. He wore black leather armor and carried an ordinary black iron sword. "That's my toilet bowl." This great Qin border soldier walked to the stream. Seeing his provocative gaze, his expression immediately turned cold. He pointed at the wooden barrel behind him and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to kill you." The bearded man looked disdainfully at the soldier who was half a head shorter than him and said, "If a wooden bucket floats up there, you say it's yours. If a princess floats up there, you also say it's yours?" The Qin dynasty soldier shook his head coldly and said, "I don't want your grassland princess, even if you give her to me. I only want my wooden bucket." Hearing these words, the bearded man became angry. His face flushed red. He said angrily, "What did you say?" The Qin dynasty soldier didn't look at him. He just looked at the wooden bucket behind him and repeated, "Give me back my toilet bowl." "Really?" The bearded man was so angry that he laughed. He took a step back and gripped the hilt of the long saber hanging from the saddle. He sneered, "Then do you have the guts to cross the stream and take it?" A strange expression flashed through the Qin dynasty soldier's eyes. He said slowly, "You forced me?" The bearded man smiled. He didn't think that this Qin dynasty soldier would dare cross the border. But in the next breath, his smile froze. The Qin dynasty soldier in black armor started to cross the stream. Clang! A loud sound was heard. By the time the Qin dynasty soldier's feet touched the solid ground, the bearded man had already unsheathed his long saber. The long saber in his hand reflected the moonlight. He pointed it directly at the chest of the Qin dynasty soldier and said coldly, "Go back." The soldier of the Qin dynasty gripped the hilt of his sword. He didn't look at him, but at the barrel. "What if I don't retreat?" he asked. The bearded man paused for a moment and said sternly, If you don't retreat, I'll kill you." The Qin dynasty soldier sneered disdainfully. With one hand on the hilt of his sword, he took a step forward and reached for the toilet bowl. "You're courting death." The bearded man shouted angrily and threw his saber forward. His original intention was to scare the Qin dynasty soldier. But to his surprise, the Qin dynasty soldier didn't even dodge. With a pop, the saber in his hand pierced through the Qin dynasty soldier's body. The bearded man was stunned, and his face quickly turned pale under the moonlight. He looked at the long trickle of blood coming out of the mouth of the Qin dynasty soldier hanging from his saber. He couldn't believe it and couldn't speak. Just for a toilet bowl. Is it worth it? This Qin soldier did not look at the wooden barrel again. Instead, he looked longingly at the moon and murmured as he gazed at the bright full moon. A shocked scream tore through the night sky. Looking at the Qin soldier who had died along with his blade, this Wuji warrior who was usually brave and skilled in battle started to tremble all over. He didn't understand what had happened. The Qin dynasty was vast. From the border with Wuji to Chongling, even an eagle would have to fly for a long time. Under the bright moon, a young man walked into a very elegant mansion and sat down in a pavilion beside a lotus pond. A delicate and pretty palace maid walked up behind him. The youth did not turn his head and said coolly, "Since the Empress is looking for me, why is she not coming to see me? The Empress will arrive soon." The delicate and pretty palace maid responded softly and stood by the side. The youth's eyebrows rose slightly. The moonlight and starlight seemed to grow brighter. The youth turned and saw the Empress slowly walk over. She looked perfect. The youth finally bowed to the Empress with a solemn expression and said, "And Baosher greets the Empress." The Empress' face still flashed with an indescribable porcelain light. She looked at Baosher and said slowly, without any preamble, "The Yuezhi have submitted. Only the Wuji remain. If we conquer the Donghu, we will have no future troubles when fighting the Yin and Qi." And Baosher stilled. In a breath, he seemed to understand the terrifying meaning in the Empress' words. He frowned slightly and did not answer. Some people are useful, and some are not. The Empress looked at him and said, "I want to hear your opinion." And Baosher thought and smiled. He said, "In a person's life, they have to do great things. What you're going to do are the greatest things in the world." The Empress was very satisfied with his words and also smiled. However, her smile also flashed with a porcelain-like cold light, without any joy. Green Vine Sword Academy. A swordsman came to the gates of the academy. His sword was very wide and large. The other swordsmen of Chongling carried swords on their backs, in their hands, or at their waists. But he walked on his sword. He was Guidanshan. The Empress had him escort Zhang Shiwu to the great floating water prison. But because of a problem with the transmission of orders, he had gone to intercept the cultivators of the god-killing army. A secluded cultivator was not famous, but many of the nobility knew he was a powerful grandmaster. A grandmaster like this visiting in the middle of the night naturally had deep meaning. The principal of the Green Vine Sword Academy, Di Qingmei, immediately appeared in front of Guidanshan. Guidanshan appeared very humble. He first put away his sword and bowed to Di Qingmei. But then his expression grew serious and he said slowly, "Principal Di, the war between the Qin dynasty and Wuji will start tonight." "What?" Di Qingmei changed expression. He thought he had heard wrong. "What I said earlier was all nonsense. Once you've heard it, you'll have to forget it. Right now, the world does not know that the war between the Qin dynasty and Wuji will start. But in 3 days, the Qin dynasty and Wuji will fight. Wuji will start this war tonight." Guidanshan looked calmly at Di Qingmei and said, "This is a war between the dynasties. So the Empress has ordered all the swordsmen and students of the Green Vine Sword Academy, other than the daily lecturers, to go to the Wuji border, including you, Principal Di." Di Qingmei's body shook and he looked in disbelief at Guidanshan. "Do not worry, it is not just the Green Vine Sword Academy." Guidanshan took a deep breath and looked up at the bright, full moon. He said slowly, "All the cultivation places of Chongling will be like this in the future, the Green Vine Sword Academy, and White Goat Cave will continue to exist. But the students in the future will accept the orders of the warden's office and work for the dynasty. He said to be at ease, but these words shocked Di Qingmei even more. Even he, who usually did not dare to disobey the intentions of the mistress of the palace, could not help but say in a trembling voice, "Are they crazy? Crazy?" That night, there were still people saying the same thing. But this person was very calm. This was a middle-aged man dressed in plain robes. Behind him was a very old Taoist temple. There were many old wormwood growing on the eaves of the temple. These wormwood were a unique golden color. They would not wither in the snowy winter and seemed to give off a treasure light. This Taoist temple was Treasure Light Temple. Standing in front of this middle-aged man dressed in plain robes was an official of the warden's office. This official's rank should be high enough, because his aura was strong enough to envelop the entire Treasure Light Temple. Not just Treasure Light Temple, all cultivation places will be like this. Treasure Light Temple was built by the previous emperor and is in Chongling. Mr. Liu, you are a Grand Master and should understand that everything should be done according to the heavens. Hearing the plain-clothed man's response, the official's emotions were calm, and he said patiently. The middle-aged man shook his head and smiled. He said, "I only heard that some things can be done and some cannot." After a pause, he looked at this official and continued, "You are also a cultivator. So you should know that what many cultivators want is not fame and fortune, but freedom." The high official of the warden's office narrowed his eyes slightly. He was about to speak when the man in plain robes interrupted him. "Do not think of using righteousness to pressure me. You have to understand that most cultivation places are like the Zhao sword furnace. If they are willing to be forced, then what is the difference between an external enemy and an internal enemy?" The high official of the warden's office took a deep breath and said, "You have made up your mind?" The middle-aged man did not say anything else. A pure sword essence came out of his body. A plain life-bond sword silently appeared in front of him. There was the sound of an enormous mountain moving in the sky. However, it was also at this moment that he raised his head. He looked towards a turret. A power came out of the top of the turret as though the entire turret was falling towards him. Chapter 416. This middle-aged man showed an indescribable bitterness. In this moment, he understood the choice of the old man on the turret who had been watching for many years. You hope to see a strong and prosperous empire, but can you ignore the lives of so many cultivators? I understand your intentions, but I do not agree. He also sensed the deliberate slowness of the power on the turret, but he still shook his head. Also, he did not agree with the actions of the mistress of the imperial palace and the man on the throne. If he could compromise, he would. If he could not, he could only use the sword. In Chongling, many things could only be spoken with the sword. Even if he could not win, at least this sword could represent his intentions. All the wormwood on the eaves of the Treasure Light Temple behind him snapped. The wormwood that had been growing for who knew how many years and was already faintly emitting a precious light instantly emitted many soft rays of light, pouring into the sword in front of him. This profound and powerful aura even caused the warden's office official's expression to change. His entire body continuously retreated, leaving behind countless explosive streams of air in the air. However, the sword in front of him did not fall towards this high official of the warden's office, nor did it meet the power on the turret. Instead, it flew straight up into the sky. A boom! At this time, all the people walking on the streets of Chongling looked in the direction of the Treasure Light Temple. A pure pillar of light appeared in Chongling, so tall it almost touched the moon. For ordinary people, this was an incomprehensible miracle, but for many people, this was a kind of warning, a kind of intention. The middle-aged man in plain robes had his hands behind his back. His vital energy and primal energies of the universe flowed out of his body like a river. When the vital energy and primal energies of the universe in his body were completely used up, this pure pillar of light finally disappeared. That white sword that had flown to an extremely high altitude came back down, bringing with it a pure white and sparkling ray of light. The sword fell down like a meteor. This middle-aged man in plain robes welcomed the fall of the sword. Hiss! This sword pierced through his heart meridian, pierced through his body, and stabbed into the stone ground behind him with blood flowing out. The Empress was standing by the pond with blooming lotus flowers. The beam of light and the sword radiance were very obvious. Naturally, she could see it very clearly. For some reason, she was inexplicably angry. Because she thought of Yin Xinlan. He thought of the same unyielding sword intent. Blood gushed out of the plain-clothed, middle-aged man's body and continued to spray onto the sword hilt, flowing into the cracks in the ground like a waterfall. His decision was very decisive, and his sword was fast enough, so he died very quickly. There was no pain, and his face was peaceful. At this moment, the closed door behind him opened with a creak. A round-faced girl appeared at this time. In the shadows behind her, there were many young boys and girls whose shoulders were twitching. This round-faced girl walked behind the plain-clothed, middle-aged man. She gripped the bloody sword hilt and pulled it out from the ground. Looking at this round-faced young lady's expression that showed no joy or sorrow, seeing her draw her sword, the warden's office high official felt his heart tighten. He couldn't help but ask the person behind him, "Who is this girl?" "Hu Jingjing." An official behind him couldn't help but have difficulty breathing. He said, "Lu Saw's direct disciple, an orphan girl." The warden's office high official inexplicably could not bear it. But looking at the round-faced young lady holding her sword, and the figures in the temple who were starting to panic, he knew this matter had to be controlled. So he took a deep breath and said harshly, "What do you want?" The round-faced young lady looked up. There were no tears in her eyes. She said in a heart-shaking calm tone, "Participate in the war. Didn't you say to my master that you want us to go to the borders?" The warden's office high official stilled. Some of the cultivators behind him and the figures in the temple behind the round-faced young lady also stilled. But strangely, everyone understood this young lady's thoughts at this time. First, she was not strong enough, and second, she needed to survive. The warden's office high official was speechless and closed his eyes in pain. Is she crazy? At this moment, he couldn't help but say these 3 words in his heart. He did not doubt the Empress' determination, and did not doubt that the Empress could not do such a thing. But after tonight, how many lives would her crazy choice change? And how many terrifying people would be created in the future? Not far behind this warden's office high official, a carriage was parked. There was a palace attendant in the carriage. This palace attendant had taken over part of Palace Attendant Rong's power. She had only been in power for a short time, so her presence was not as cold as Palace Attendant Rong's. Her features were also prettier than Palace Attendant Rong's. The youth sitting opposite her was in Baoshi. I admire this female student of Treasure Light Temple very much. When he saw the round-faced young lady draw her sword and heard her reply, and Baoshi turned to look at the palace attendant and said, "While her talent is average and not as good as most of the students participating in the Min Mountain Sword Trials, and her cultivation is low, I feel that she will be stronger than most of the young talents in Chongling." The pretty palace attendant nodded seriously and said, "Mr. N is right." And Baoshi smiled faintly and said, "But no matter how good she is, it is useless." Among the young people of Chongling, in the end, the strongest is still me. His words were arrogant, but his expression and tone gave people the feeling that this was a matter of course. The pretty palace attendant said seriously again, "Mr. N is right." Ding Ning stood in front of the window with his clothes draped over his shoulders. He coughed softly. He had started to use the 9-death silkworm and the heaven-replenishing divine art to heal his wounds, but he knew he could not appear too fast. Looking at the pillar of light that had disappeared from Treasure Light Temple, he said in a cold voice, "Zheng Xiao has started to go crazy. Do you feel proud or displeased?" Zhang Sun Qinchua's cool voice sounded from the darkness. Ding Ning turned around, looked at her and said, "When I see many people die and cannot do anything, I no longer feel proud. With the 9-death silkworm here, she and Yuanwu will not be happy." Ding Ning was silent for a moment and then said, "But if she and Yuanwu do not die, I will not be happy." Huang Jinwei was not on the turret, but he sensed the power coming from the turret. He naturally saw the pillar of light from Treasure Light Temple. For a long time, he could not stand and move. His breathing could not be normal for a long time. He seemed to be able to see the helplessness and sadness in the old man's eyes. He seemed to be able to see the middle-aged man's determination as he faced his sword. He knew that more people were going to die. He knew that there would be a storm of blood like the 3 years before Yuanwu's ascension, and even fiercer. He bit his lips in pain until they bled. 9 Death Silkworm. Such a voice kept echoing in his body. At this time, he only thought that if he wanted to end this, if he wanted the Empress and the Holy One to stop, he had to find the 9 Death Silkworm. There was a small boat floating on the Wei River. Bai Shanshui, Zhao Si, Lin Jujio, and Zhang Shiwu were all in this boat. So the boat was very deep in the water and looked like it would sink at any moment. Ever since the pillar of light lit up in Chongling, Bai Shanshui stood at the bow of the boat with her hands behind her back. She narrowed her eyes and asked, "Military Advisor Lin, what can we do?" Lin Jujio shook his head in the cabin and said, "We cannot do anything. In reality, I'm not a military advisor. I am just a steward." Zhang Shiwu did not react. He was seriously wounded, but at this time he was looking at the stove behind Bai Shanshui. There was a pot of beef soup boiling on the stove. Lin Jujio loved beef soup. He had not had beef soup like this for a long time. Zhao Si stilled and looked at Lin Jujio. "What do you mean?" Chapter 417. Lin Jujio looked at the pot of beef soup that was already thick. After not eating his favorite food for a long time, he didn't know what kind of temptation this pot of beef soup had for him. However, he knew that this pot of beef soup had yet to reach its most delicious state. Therefore, he still waited patiently. The Qin destroyed the 3 dynasties, and the Bazin Kendo ground was recognized as the strongest sect in the world. Everyone in the world thought that I was the strategist of the people of the Bazin Kendo ground back then, and that many of the schemes were carried out because of me. Lin Jujio smiled and said, "But in reality, most of the schemes came from him." Zhao Si frowned deeply. She looked at Lin Jujio and spoke honestly about her feelings. "You should know that in the past, of the Qin people my sword furnace wanted to kill the most, you were in the top 3. Everyone in the world knows that many of the schemes of the Qin army came from you. But now you say these schemes have nothing to do with you? Because this is a scheme in and of itself." Lin Jujio looked up at her and said emotionally, "Back then, everyone knew that Wang Jingmeng was the strongest in the Bazin Kendo ground with the sword. They all knew that no one was a match for him in a one-on-one fight. If they knew that he was not just the strongest in Chongling, but also the strategist of the Bazin Kendo ground, all the enemies would only have one thought: kill him at all costs." Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui exchanged a look. They understood the meaning in Lin Jujio's words, but they still did not dare to believe it. There were too many stories about Lin Jujio, and they had experienced many of them. "You mean this was a scheme to share his danger?" Bai Shanshui could not help but ask Lin Jujio. In the view of many people back then, a strategist who could foresee things was much more terrifying than a pure, invincible swordsman in war. Lin Jujio laughed. "Also, for everyone, I am much easier to kill than him. So there will always be more people trying to assassinate me than him. Also, they do not know what kind of trap to assassinate him. But to assassinate me, they only need to find the right opportunity and set up 2 or 3 cultivators stronger than me. In a way, I am a bait to attract many assassins to their deaths." Zhao Si heard his words and thought of those grandmasters who had died trying to assassinate Lin Jujio. He felt more and more ironic and sorrowful. The Bazin Kendo ground is really scary. Bai Shanshui laughed self-mockingly and said, "Then what does being a steward mean?" "It means property." Lin Jujio said without hesitation, "My memory is very good. My mind is an account book. I know who is from the Bazin Kendo ground, and I know where some of the things of the Bazin Kendo ground are." Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui completely understood now and said at the same time, "You mean the Bazin Kendo ground has many things that Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu do not control?" Lin Jujio could not help but laugh. "Swords and sword manuals, those are just things on the surface. Otherwise, Why do you think Zheng Xiao and Yuan Wu did not bear to kill me for so many years? Zhao Si could not understand even more. Back then, the Bazinkindo ground had so many famed swords and powerful sword manuals. In these decades, they had created countless experts in Chongling. If the swords and sword manuals of a sect were not the most important things, then what was the most important? Lin Juju knew she could not understand. He also knew that these people were trustworthy, and there were not many people like them left. At this time, the pot of beef soup had reached the most suitable time. So he motioned for Zhang Shiwu to extinguish the fire. Then he scooped a bowl of beef soup and slowly drank. Let's use an analogy. Drinking something he had not tasted for a long time, he groaned in comfort and then said, Zheng Xiu thinks that the Chu dynasty is hers, but in the Bazin Kindo ground, more than half is ours. Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui shook at the same time. A wave of water rose by the side of the boat and was turned into fine powder by the presence of the two people. Like a layer of fine white flour, it sprinkled onto the black water. You calculated and calculated, but could not count your own people. Lin Jujio looked at the moon reflected in the water. His smug expression disappeared. He sighed softly. He did not die at the hands of so many powerful enemies, but died at the hands of his own people. If he did not die, not just the Chu, maybe the other two dynasties would be gone. Zhao Si and Bai Shanshui were silent for a long time. They first thought of Lin Jujio's words about the present Chu dynasty. Bai Shanshui took a breath and managed to calm herself. She asked tentatively, Demon Consort Zhao? Lin Jujio nodded. Zhao Si said coldly, How is that possible? Lin Jujio looked seriously at her and said, Everyone has their own way of doing things. Zhao Si wanted to argue, but when she thought of Zheng Xiu, her expression turned ugly and she could not speak. Lin Jujio looked mockingly at her and said, You probably would not have thought that Li Lingjun becoming the new emperor of the Chu dynasty is related to Zheng Xiu's arrangements, but the matter of going with the flow is related to us. In this moment, Zhao Si had the impulse to knock over the pot of beef soup in front of Lin Jujio. Fortunately, Lin Jujio spoke quickly. I used a part of the wealth of the Ba Mountain Sword Horde to have Li Lingjun grow quickly. Anything that grows quickly will have some flaws. Zheng Xiu also thinks so. So we successfully had Li Lingjun enter her sight and become her pawn. For us, we hope that there are no strong controllers in the Chu. So Zheng Xiu hopes to control the Chu through Li Lingjun, but in reality, you feel that Li Lingjun is easily controlled by you. Bai Shanshui smiled in admiration. This was also that person's plan back then? No. Lin Jujio shook his head. Lin Jujio shook his head. You do not understand Zheng Xiu well enough. Zheng Xiu's way of doing things always ends with cold blood. She had Li Lingjun go back because she wanted the Chu dynasty controlled by Li Lingjun to be easier to deal with in the future. As to this plan, after a pause, he smiled self-deprecatingly and said, This is my own idea. After he died, we had to do something. I just hope that we did not do anything wrong. Zhao Si heard some of his words, and his brow furrowed deeply. You don't know his heir, don't know his arrangements? I am not the closest person to him. Even if we are brothers, we are not close enough to sleep in the same bed, sleep on the same pillow, and talk face to face. Lin Jujio thought of that person's last moments, and his smile grew dimmer than the moonlight on the water. If I knew, then Zheng Xiu would have known long ago. Back then, no one on the Bazinkindo ground would have thought that he would have an heir because he was so strong and not even at his strongest. He was so invincible and young. He did not need to be in a hurry to find an heir. Thinking of how these enemies who had once been difficult to deal with ended up like this, Zhao Si felt dark pleasure. She looked up at the bright moon. She did not disguise her emotions and said with slight disdain, Maybe none of you know him well enough? Lin Jujio looked at her and did not speak. Even Zhao Si felt strange. When a person dies, it is easiest to see others and oneself clearly. Lin Jujio finished the bowl of beef soup in his hand and slowly said, He died in battle in Chongling. Who could not see him clearly? Bai Shanshui said, You are all sure he is dead? Lin Jujio said coolly, He fought to the last drop of blood, and even his body turned to dust. In the end, nothing was left. Can he still live? Zhao Si thought that countless people had seen it with their own eyes. There was no doubt. So she thought and said, "You are all so smart. Why did he have to die in battle in Chongling back then?" Because in that battle, he really saved many people out of Chongling. Lin Zhujiu laughed scornfully and said, "Because just like how Ba Mountain Sword Field died together, there are many things you do not know behind the scenes." Chapter 4:18. Bai Shanshui and Zhao Si exchanged a look and did not speak. They knew, just like what Zheng Xiu had done tonight, many things, once started, would not stop. Since Lin Zhujiu thought that they could be trusted, and had started to tell them some old matters, and things they should pay attention to when fighting against Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu, he would not stop and would continue. After Yuan Wu ascended the throne, he killed so many people and burned so many books. He did not just erase Wang Jingming's existence. Many people know that Zheng Xiu is cruel, but they underestimate her cruelty. Lin Zhujiu smiled disdainfully. Just as they had thought, he continued to speak. One of the reasons he had to go to Chongling was because of Yangshan Commandery. He came from Yangshan Commandery. After starting the Chongling Rebellion, Zheng Xiu gave him a letter. The contents of the letter said that if he did not go to Chongling, she would order the army to slaughter Yangshan Commandery and the 13 cities of Yangshan Commandery, not even sparing women and children. In order to make him believe her determination, she massacred a city. The army that massacred the city was the present god-killing army. That was Jiaowei City. Zhao Si's breathing started to become uneven. So it was not the Chu army that massacred the city? That Chu army was massacred by the god-killing army. They were just forced to take the blame. Lin Zhujiu said disdainfully. Even though he obeyed the agreement and went to Chongling and died in battle in Chongling, she still ceded Yangshan Commandery to the Chu. The king of Chu received a great benefit for no reason, so he did not make a sound and let that Chu army take the blame. Bai Shanshui's expression grew uglier. So the destruction of the Bazin Kendo ground was due to the same tactics? That is not the case. Lin Zhujiu grew silent and said, "At the time, there were disagreements in the Bazin Kendo ground. It has nothing to do with the betrayal of a few people." Yan Xinlan felt that his death was only to end this matter. She also decided to follow his final wishes. She did not want to destroy the things that we had personally built for so long and sacrificed so many people to complete. However, some of us did not want to fulfill his wish. This is a different choice. Just like the choice of some people in Chongling right now. Some people choose to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. They want to see the birth of an unprecedented dynasty, the world unified, and there will be no more wars. This was also that person's dream. However, many people still find it hard to accept. In the end, they are a group of dragons without a leader, and they are not as cold as Zheng Xiu. Lin Zhujiu was silent for a long time, and then said, "He is not just a symbol of invincibility on the Bazin Kendo ground. Crucially, he is the leader of the dragons." No one would have thought that they would lose him first. In short, the world's strongest Bazin Kendo ground is in chaos. Actually, there's no chance. If there was a chance, I'd really like to see him before he died and hear his final opinion. His opinion about the entire world and Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. Is it to give the world to Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu and have them do what we want to do, build an unprecedented dynasty, or something else? No one spoke, because everyone had different opinions and methods of doing things. Some people, some matters, according to other people's opinions and methods of doing things, might be very stupid, but they were still worthy of their admiration. Even more importantly, Lin Zhujiu's hypothesis could not be established, because they could not return to that person's death in battle and appear by his side. Maybe for that person, it had been very difficult to choose at the time, especially when he found that he could not completely control everything. He could not make choices for others. These years, I have been very good in the great floating water prison. At least I can listen, but I cannot do many things. Lin Zhujiu's voice once again broke the silence. So now, I cannot decide what to do next. Since the Nine-Death Silkworm was able to plan and save me, I want to hear his opinion and his view of the world. Lin Zhujiu looked up, and his gaze swept across by Shan Shui, Zhao Si, and the others. He slowly smiled. You are all serpents crossing the river. To be able to gather you. He is the dragon head. The surface of the river fell silent again. Lin Zhujiu's words contained too much information, the past, present, and what was about to happen in the future. But thinking of the youth who had accomplished the inconceivable, by Shan Shui and Zhao Si felt Lin Zhujiu's words were reasonable. There is also something to be happy about. Some people in the Bazin Kendo ground, just like back then, may not agree with my thoughts, but they will have good feelings towards the Nine-Death Silkworm. At least, they will not become our enemies, Lin Zhujiu said softly, with some emotion and satisfaction. But after tonight, we will truly be lonely ghosts in Chongling. It was also at this moment that a gentle and quiet voice sounded from the vast water surface. A black boat, accompanied by black fog, quietly appeared on the surface of the water, not far from the small boat they were in. At the bow of the boat, a stooped old man was holding a pole. Behind him sat a woman holding a zither. In the cabin behind the woman sat a young man. Young people recover quickly. Lin Zhujiu looked at the young man and could not help but laugh. Bai Shanshui looked at him, a hint of red appearing on her cheeks. But she was a great bandit with great boldness, a great rebel. So she immediately smiled proudly and said, "It is good that you are not dead. I always keep my words." Zhao Si glanced at her and inexplicably laughed. He said, "This is such a coincidence. Today seems to be the double seventh, the day when the Magpie Bridge meets. Today is the double seventh." Yi Sealing stood at the head of the bridge and looked at where the pillar of light had disappeared. She heard footsteps behind her, but did not turn her head. Then she heard this familiar voice. "If there is love, then there is love. If there is no love, then there is no love." The double seventh, 8 seventh, 9 seventh, 100 seventh, 10 seventh. What is the use? You're just deceiving yourself. She did not turn her head and spoke coldly. Chief Inspector Chun, dressed in deep red robes but still unable to disguise his lonely and moldy presence, looked at her back and smiled inexplicably. He said, "Being able to stand behind you and look at you is perfection." Yi Sealing did not respond, but she did not leave. She just stood at the head of the bridge and looked at the night sky. Bureau Chief Chin did not speak. He stood 100 feet away from her and looked quietly at the night sky. However, there was a faint smile at the corners of his pale lips. With the Nine-Death Silkworm here, she and Yuanwu will not be happy. But if she and Yuanwu do not die, I will not be happy. After Ding Ning said these words, Zhang Sun Qinshue's voice no longer sounded in the darkness. Just like falling parasol, this meant that their conversation had ended. But Ding Ning did not return to his bed and walked toward Zhang Sun Qinshue's room in the darkness. "What do you want to do?" Zhang Sun Qinshue's cold voice sounded with a hint of indescribable coldness. Ding Ning said, "Help me heal." A wave of killing intent appeared in front of his hand that pushed open the door. "Not because today is the double seventh." Ding Ning shook his head and said softly and seriously, "Just because I survived." Zhang Sun Qinshu stood behind the door. Her expression was still cold, but her eyelashes kept on twitching. She suddenly felt viciousness in her heart and could not help but say, "What do you think of Zheng Xiu and the Yuanwu meet today? Strange bedfellows." Ding Ning smiled faintly and said, "There are many strange bedfellows today. Why care about these adulterous couples?" Not caring might be the attitude that Zhang Sun Qinshu needed. If he didn't care, it meant that he cared about something else. Ding Ning pushed open the door and walked in. Chapter 419. After Treasure Light Temple was the Hut Stone Sword Workshop. The Hut Stone Sword Workshop was very hot. Inside, a bare-chested man was forging a sword. When the beam of light shot into the sky from Treasure Light Temple, this man turned to look, but did not stop forging. He had a golden hammer in his hands. This hammer was much smaller than the hammers used to forge black iron, but it was astoundingly heavy. Each time it hit the burning sword, the ground of the entire workshop would shake violently, and the natural black iron patterns on the burning sword would ripple like waves. After the beam of light disappeared from Treasure Light Temple for 3 breaths, some rapid hoofbeats sounded in the streets outside the Hut Stone Sword Workshop. A dozen officials from the warden's office entered the workshop and appeared in front of this man. The leading warden's office official wanted to speak, but this man did not give him a chance to speak. The rhythm of the golden hammer hitting the burning sword suddenly sped up. A layer of ripples appeared on the ground. These dozen warden's office officials could not stand steadily. They were all powerful cultivators. Being unable to stand meant that their vital energy was shaken. Shock and disbelief appeared in the eyes of these dozen or so officials of the warden's office. They knew that the second place after Treasure Light Temple had its own intentions. Yet they had not expected the master of this small temple to be so powerful and to use such a method to welcome them. Actually, I have always wanted to experience your sword essence. The man forging the sword did not look at these warden's office officials. He looked up at the night sky and said, "There was a turret there. A powerful force was being nurtured on the turret." After saying this, the golden hammer in his hand landed on the burning sword nucleus, and he did not raise it again. Because with just this one strike, the golden hammer in his hand had been completely shattered, turning into countless golden fragments. These golden shards did not scatter in all directions. Instead, they were all absorbed by the ripples on the sword as the sword embryo vibrated beneath it. The ripples on the sword melted the metal fragments. Then the ripples on the sword did not transmit the vibrations into the ground, but spread through the air. The sword embryo disappeared. Countless real, golden ripples appeared in the air, facing the sword intent that had already condensed on the turret. One of the walls in this room of the sword workshop was destroyed like paper. Golden ripples rushed out and collided with a huge wall of invisible sword chi. There was a loud boom. It was as if 2 huge mountains had collided in the sky. The turret trembled slightly. The old man at the top of the turret looked at where his feet were. Fine cracks appeared on the hard boulder under his feet. The light in his eyes dimmed, and some lines of blood appeared in the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. As expected of someone who has guarded Chongling for many years. Even after destroying the sword he refined for so many years, he is still not a match. The bare-chested man said respectfully and spat out a mouthful of blood. Without any hesitation, he turned around and left. He walked away from the turret, and the wall in front of him was torn apart by the airflow brought about by his body as if it didn't exist. However, after passing through a street, he stopped. Under a locust tree in front of him, a youth was waiting for him. Embark, the bare-chested man frowned and understood who this youth was. The youth who gave people the feeling that he was floating in the clouds even when standing on the ground, bowed to the bare-chested man and said, "Since Elder Mo ye has tried the city-guarding sword, I think you do not want to miss the Lingshu Sword Gate sword. The teachers of my Sword Gate sect admire Elder's sword essence greatly. If I miss it, I will feel regret." The bare-chested man suddenly roared with laughter. He pointed a finger at Embark and laughed so hard that his body trembled. One of the 2 recognized geniuses of Chongling, the strongest monster in the history of Lingshu Sword Gate. I had not expected you to be willing to be a dog, wasting Lingshu Sword Gate's efforts. Amidst the laughter, Embark's expression did not change, but his gaze grew prouder. Everyone has different opinions. I only care how to make my sword essence stronger. If not for the Empress, how could I have so many chances to unleash my sword essence and fight so many grandmasters without regard for life and death? Hearing Embark's words, the bare-chested man stopped laughing. He knew that this monster was really a monster, but a different kind of cultivation fanatic from Su Xiaomu. You and Zheng Xiao are suitable. You are both cold enough. To you, everyone is just a tool to improve your sword essence. Thinking of some things, the bare-chested man's gaze grew strange. He slowly said, "But since you respect me as your elder, I can remind you that after Yunwu ascended the throne, Zheng Xiao's cultivation has been stagnant. Her present may be your future." And Embark thought seriously for a moment. Then he said to the bare-chested man, "Then I will at least reach her level." The bare-chested man coughed softly and said, "Fighting now is fair." After saying this, a terrifying sword essence came out of his body again. Countless tiny lights with life-bond presence flashed in the space around him and in Bowsher, like countless sparks of metal created by hitting the sword nucleus. And Bowsher reached out and swiped through the air like he had attacked, but no one could see where his sword essence went. A look of shock appeared in his eyes. Then, like a sword embryo that had been struck, his body shook countless times in an instant. Blood sprayed out of his nostrils and mouth. The bare-chested man stopped moving. He shook his head and then fell backwards. And Bowsher was silent for a moment. Then he bowed to the distant turret, and then to the bare-chested man who had stopped breathing. He thanked the old man on the turret and apologized to the man from the Hutstone sword workshop. He had not expected this man to be able to defeat his sword essence after being seriously injured. This meant that his sword essence was not strong enough. A cold general in black armor stood behind the tired Mo Shoching. He did not speak, but his heavy breathing allowed Mo Shoching to understand what he was thinking. Mo Shoching sighed softly and said, "I know you feel it is unfair, but for my choice, and Bowsher cannot die, and in Bowsher does not care. Can I care what the people of Chongling think of me?" The cold general's body trembled slightly. He bowed to Mo Shoching and said, "Mr. is righteous. How can you make such a decision? Like draining the pond to catch fish. This is shaking the foundation of the country. The destiny belongs to Chongling. The reason that Chongling has so many talents is because these cultivation places are not restrained. Also, the cultivators of these cultivation places enlist in the army for military service. And it is natural. You are destroying your own foundation. This is crazy." Deep in the imperial palace, on the usually quiet passageway, dozens of officials were standing. The empress stood on the jade steps and looked coldly at these officials who did not care for their lives as she listened to their fierce words. "In your view, this is shaking the foundation of the country, but in my view, this is just a temporary pain. If there is no change, how can the destiny belong to Chongling? Do not forget that the Shang family was in charge of changing the old system. This is the combined power of all forces. How can you say it is destroying the foundation? Everything I've done will only make Great Qin even more powerful. You should know that my decision will not change. You should know that you only need to make a choice. The Qin dynasty used the sword to establish the country. Words are useless." She listened for a long time, and then argued simply. Then she turned and walked back to her study. Chapter 420. After Treasure Light Temple was the Cottage Stone Sword Workshop, and after the Cottage Stone Sword Workshop was the Qing Mountain Sword School. The old principal of the Qing Mountain Sword School was Nie Yinshan. His status was very special. He had been a commander of the Qin dynasty during the war against the Han. In the view of many people in Chongling's warden's office, if he had not been seriously injured in the battle against the Han at Giant Wolf Mountain, and had lost an arm holding a sword, he would have had a seat among the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. It was a pity that Nie Yinshan had retired early as a commander of an army. But as the principal of the Qing Mountain Sword School, he had enjoyed many years of peace and had taught a good disciple. His disciple was Yin Sun. He had once been an abandoned disciple of a sword school. But under his tutelage, he was ranked in the top 5 among the group of young people in Chongling in terms of speed of reaching Realm 7. Yin Sun's strongest skill was his flying sword, even after reaching Realm 7. He was recognized in Chongling as the Grand Master whose flying sword was the strangest and most changeable, and the Grand Master whose flying sword could not be discovered. While he cultivated the sword path, and not the ghostly path with deep Yin energy, all the cultivators in Chongling were used to calling him the Ghost Swordsman. When the light of Treasure Light Temple shot into the sky, Nie Yinshan summoned Yin Sun in front of him. The army had not reached the Qing Mountain Sword School, and the Grand Master of the Cottage Stone Sword School had not fought with Mo Shoching. But Nie Yinshan already knew what order the Empress had given tonight. He used a few simple words to tell Yin Sun what was happening in Chongling right now. Sun's first reaction was intense. Many bright, sword lights appeared around him. That was the power accumulated in his body that could not help but leak out of his body. Do not be like them. But Shan looked calmly at him and said, I called you here so that you will not be like them. Sun naturally could not understand. He took a deep breath and said, Why? Shan did not answer and asked in return, Then what do you think is best to do? Sun looked at him and said, Escape Chongling. After a slight pause, he said coldly, If there are many cultivation places that oppose, she will not succeed. Shan shook his head. There won't be too many cultivation places that object. Sun looked at the beam of light that had just disappeared and felt that the words of her beloved and respected teacher were laughable. He thought of the 3 years before Yuanwu ascended the throne. Could the present Chongling endure that kind of rain of blood? Daring to bear this kind of blood rain? The present Chongling is not the Chongling of the past. Shan saw through his thoughts and smiled with mixed emotions. You should know that the current 13 marquises were originally left behind after sorting through them. Prime Minister Yin and Prime Minister Li would not object. Lingshu Sword Gate and Min Mountain Sword Sect had stayed out of Chongling's affairs in the past few years. If Lingshu Sword Gate and Min Mountain Sword Sect did not take the lead, they would be leaderless. The more extreme her actions are, the easier it is for her to succeed. In the end, Chongling will lose many cultivators and even many cultivation places. But the power will return to the imperial city. This is something that no previous dynasty has done. Shan looked at Sun, whose expression was growing uglier, and said slowly, Even more importantly, the centralization of power in the imperial city was proposed by that person at the beginning of the Shang reform. In these years, Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu were only following his path of unifying the world. Prime Minister Yin, Prime Minister Li, and those marquises, most of them agreed with this view. Those people who did not agree with his view could not reach high positions in the purge of the reform back then. What? Sun finally could not control his emotions and spoke in disbelief. Back then, those people were able to defeat the old nobility, succeed in the reform, and build the powerful Qin dynasty. It was that person's ambition and view. Shan smiled emotionally. Even during the Yu Emperor's time, although all the countries in the world submitted to him, when the Yu Emperor died, the dynasty fell apart. The vassal states went back to fighting each other. There has never been a dynasty that could truly unify the world. What that person wanted to do was not just to unify the world, but to have all the power in the world return to the court. One order, and the world will follow. After pausing for a few breaths, Shan looked at the speechless Sun and said, He believes that if all cultivation lands belong to the army, they can be mobilized like soldiers and subjects. Then, even if some cultivation lands lose the ability to change naturally, the combined power will still be much stronger than it is now. With schools as cultivation places, everyone in the world can cultivate. When the time comes, the best will be chosen. This was that person's idea back then. Sun was still unable to speak. Shan laughed again. His laughter was filled with emotion. But this is no different from a reform. Zheng Xiu just doesn't have the courage to do so. Sun suddenly completely realized. He looked at Shan and said heavily, It is the 9-death silkworm. This time, Shan did not speak. Sun continued coldly. Min Mountain Sword Sect and Lingshu Sword Gate exist side by side, but are not the leader. The 9-death silkworm is the head of the dragons. She is afraid of the 9-death silkworm, afraid that many cultivators in Chongling will be slowly used by the 9-death silkworm. She wants to turn the Qin dynasty into an iron empire as quickly as possible. At that time, no matter how strong the 9-death silkworm is, it will have little help. How can one person fight against a dynasty? Shan sighed softly. Pity. Sun was inexplicably angry. He said, Since she is fated to succeed, why pity? Pity that she is many years too slow. Shan looked at him and shook his head seriously. He said, Back then, the destruction of the Bazin Kendo ground was the best time. Many of the cultivation places in Chongling were afraid of being killed, especially when the court was purged. At that time, the nobility had no other thoughts. But back then, that person entered Chongling with one sword and killed too many cultivators of her and Yuanwu. Yin Xinlan of the Bazinkindo ground chose the same method, so she and Yuanwu did not have enough experts to use. If she forced this, I fear that the Chu, Yin, and Qi dynasties would come with armies. Now, it is many years too late. Many people have other thoughts. The easier it is for her to succeed this time. And the more people who do not like her have not died, the more hidden dangers there will be in the future. This Iron Empire may not be so iron. Back then, she succeeded in killing that person, but that person used his sword to kill so many of her people and left behind the 9-death silkworm. She was only able to do this many years later. In my view, in terms of the overall situation, the two of them won one battle each. In Sun knew that his master had once been the commander of an army. Her views and height were naturally different from those of ordinary grandmasters. At this moment, he completely understood that his master was only telling him to accept Zheng Xiu's orders and not resist. However, he suddenly felt humiliated and lost. Nie Yinshan looked at him, whose head was slowly bowed and whose lips were trembling. He seemed to see through the other's mind. Nie Yinshan sighed softly. He looked up at the moon in the night sky and said softly, "Is it to stand on righteousness and build an empire that will prosper forever? Or do you feel that other people's actions are too despicable and want to fight?" Back then in Chongling, many people made different choices. But in reality, what was decided in the end was one's own will and emotions. "You are a disciple that I taught." Nie Yinshan turned his head and looked at Yin Sun. He said, "If you want to fight, I hope that you will fight for the court, fight for your friends and family. Take care of yourself, and do not participate in her grievances with other people. Life is like a battle. Everywhere is a battle." Chapter 421. Countless people had countless opinions, but this night was torturous for most cultivators in Chongling. The vast and unstoppable power that came down from the turrets came one after another. Each one usually meant the death of a powerful cultivator, or the death of a cultivation place, or submission. They knew that the old man guarding the city was strong, but they were still shocked when they sensed the endless power coming down one after another. They thought that they had underestimated the power of this old man. Really crazy, in a certain alley, a cultivator with a sword sensed the great power coming down from the turrets. He imagined the bloody scent contained in the power and said to his companion with an ugly expression, "Even if it is as the Empress thinks, and all the cultivation places submit to the imperial palace and accept conscription like an army, she did not think that these cultivation places, these secluded grandmasters, are Chongling's barrier. They're the true reason why many cultivators from other dynasties do not dare to easily enter Chongling. Even if the Empress succeeds, Chongling will be empty in the future." "So, what if it is empty?" His companion also had an ugly expression. He said coldly, "Maybe she wants Chongling to be empty and lure in those people from other dynasties. This way, all of Chongling will be an enormous trap." Mo Shoqing has used so many swords today. Does he not think about the Shang family of the past? The cultivator with the sword said this angrily. However, in the next instant his body went rigid. A man in a light yellow robe was walking on a stone path in front of him. Behind the man in the light yellow robe, there were some officials and attendants following him from a distance. Many cultivators in Chongling recognized this elegant man in light yellow robes as Huang Jinwei. Mo Shoqing, whom he was criticizing, was Huang Jinwei's most respected teacher. Huang Jinwei passed through this alley. He heard the conversation between the two cultivators, but he did not feel any anger, only growing pain and sorrow. He knew that the words of these two ordinary cultivators on the street were correct. As the executor of the Empress' decree, his teacher Mo Shoqing was fated to be the target of many people's anger. Many people would hate the Empress, but they would also hate Mo Shoqing, who had killed their teacher. If Mo Shoqing was an ambitious general like Liang Lian, Huang Jinwei might feel better right now. But he knew that at this time, Mo Shoching was just a dying oil lamp, giving the last light to this dynasty. He also knew the state of Mo Shoching's body. He knew that Mo Shoching was very tired right now. Each time he used this kind of power, it was a heavy burden on his body. Therefore, every time the power from the turret appeared, he felt more and more helpless. He had been searching for clues for a long time, but he still couldn't find any clues. At this moment, he sensed another wave of energy coming from the turret, and this wave of energy was even stronger than before. This invisible power landed in Chongling like a heavenly punishment. Huang Jinwei knew that was the Half-Mountain Sword Hall. That was one of the cultivation places with the highest number of students and teachers in Chongling. Feeling such a majestic sword, the scene of that place almost directly appeared in his mind. Many students and teachers were holding swords to fight against the army. But at this time, a terrifying sword essence came down. The sword-wielding students and teachers in front of the Half-Mountain Sword Hall turned into a bloody wave. "Teacher!" Huang Jinwei shouted in pain. He knew that after this attack, his teacher would be even more tired, and he knew that his teacher who had attacked would be in more pain than him. A chasm dozens of feet wide suddenly appeared in front of the Half-Mountain Sword Hall. A wave of blood surged up from the chasm. There were many dim sword lights in the wave of blood, many broken pieces of swords, and many pieces of clothing. The remaining Half-Mountain Sword Hall students and teachers behind the chasm could not believe their eyes. They could not believe that in a breath, so many of their friends had been crushed by such a power and turned into a wave of blood. The wave of blood surged up like a wall. It seemed to cover the moonlight, causing the bright moon to turn blood red. The Half-Mountain Sword Hall cultivators behind the chasm unconsciously trembled and could not take another step forward. On the turret, the wrinkles on Mo Shoching's face deepened, so deep that the skin on his face seemed to have blood. These wrinkles seemed to have turned into cracks, and his blood was going to seep out of these cracks. The cold general behind him held the rattan chair he was sitting on and could not help but say, "Do you want to rest?" Mo Shoching shook his head and said, "Other people can rest, but I cannot." The cold general slowly bowed his head. He knew that after tonight, many people would remember that Mo Shoching had killed countless people, but few people would be certain that Mo Shoching had prevented more people from dying. Tonight, no one in Chongling looked at the clinic that the Xie family had booked. Zhang Sun Qinxue was more excited than usual, so the wind and snow in her room were more reckless than usual. Although they were on the same bed, she and Ding Ning sat side by side, separated by only half a foot. "Are you sure my energy can help you heal?" she asked coldly as she looked at Ding Ning, who was trembling in the cold. "To me, your vitality is like an addictive drug." Ding Ning looked at her and nodded with certainty. He said seriously, "My body is used to having this kind of energy. When I release it all in front of Liang Lian, my body cannot adapt." Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent for a moment and said, "Just because we are used to each other." Ding Ning shook his head without hesitation. "Not just because of habit." Zhang Sun Qinxue was silent for a long time and said, "Is there really a chance to start over in life?" Ding Ning was silent for a long time and said, "In the end, what one has to face in life is one's own heart. What one seeks in the end is the peace of one's heart. When one understands what one truly wants, when one sees clearly, everything will flow naturally." Flow naturally? Zhang Sun Qinxue gave a rare smile. She looked in the direction of the invisible power on the turret. "Many things tonight make one think of many things from many years ago. Can people really put down their hatred? If the entire family is destroyed and all of her relatives die because of someone, will she still forgive that person?" Ding Ning bowed his head. He did not answer Zhang Sun Qinshue's question. He did not look at Zhang Sun Qinshue's bleak smile. He said slowly, "All grudges will end. If you do not like this city, then we can leave." Zhang Sun Qinxue suddenly turned to look at him. Tonight, those who died were the cultivators of the cultivation places who were not willing to submit to Zheng Xiu's wishes. But the first to bear the brunt was Min Mountain Sword Sect. Ding Ning slowly said, "If Zheng Xiu wants to succeed completely, She has to prove to everyone that she has made up her mind. She can only have Min Mountain Sword Sect submit to her orders. Zhang Sun Qinxue said in a cold voice. Bailey Sushue will agree? He will agree. Ding Ning nodded and said, because what Zheng Xiu did tonight will make him understand that Zheng Xiu will pay any price. Min Mountain Sword Sect will bear the brunt. The sooner he agrees, the less Zheng Xiu will make him pay. After a pause, Ding Ning said disdainfully, this is a transaction between the powerful. No one will say it, but they all know their limits. At this time, Zheng Xiu just wants him to express some attitude. Also, the other reason Bailey Sushue will agree is because Jing Liuli and I are both in Chongling. For him, this is the future of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Jing Liuli will be allowed to return to Min Mountain Sword Sect. Based on Zheng Xiu's attitude, I will be sent to a certain border battlefield with the students of the cultivation places who dare to defy her orders. But I am a disciple of Min Mountain Sword Sect, so if I ask to take some people, I will be allowed. Because he feared Zhang Sun Qinxue would object, Ding Ning added after saying this. The best strategy is to go with the flow, act according to the opponent's wishes, and then use the opponent. Acting according to the opponent's intentions can often predict the enemy's moves. Zhang Sun Qinxue turned away and did not look at him or think about his words. He said coldly, in my view, it is because you understand her too well. For some reason, Ding Ning could not help but smile slightly, and then said, this is just one aspect. Chapter 422. Chief Inspector Chen looked at Yi Seeling's back and was speechless for the entire night. In the morning, Yi Seeling, who had been standing like a doll at the bridge, turned around. Her gaze landed on an ordinary ditch next to Chief Inspector Chen. The water flowing in the ditch on this ordinary street was the same as Chief Inspector Chen's robes, deep red and rippling with the scent of blood. You are standing here tonight looking at me because you fear the Empress will do something even crazier and take the chance to deal with me. Yi Seeling pressed her lips together slightly. She did not smile, but showed two beautiful dimples. Look, after this night, even the water in the ditch is dyed red with blood. If I stay in Chongling, I will only think about life and death. I will not have the leisure. Chief Inspector Chen had a rare smile, like the morning sun. If you do not like this place, it is not as if you cannot leave. Go where? Yi Seeling once again showed the presence that could not be refuted when she faced Zhao Zhan. She said coolly, Mo Shouqing chose to become a stepping stone for the Empress' ambition, and let the Empress do something no one has ever done. I believe in that person's judgment. In the future, the Qin dynasty will swallow the Chu, Yin, and Qi dynasties. In the world, where is Chongling not? Where can we go? Do not speak of the immortal mountains overseas. After a pause, Yi Seeling looked at Chief Inspector Chen, who was about to speak, and said, Official Su took almost all of the Qin dynasty's ironclad warships overseas, and even unified the island countries overseas. Chief Inspector Chen was not an ordinary Chongling citizen. He knew that what Yi Seeling said was not impossible, so he could not refute it. If we want to truly leave Chongling, we have to resolve all our grievances in Chongling. Otherwise, where in the world is not Chongling? Yi Seeling smiled and turned back to the bridge. Then he walked towards the alley on the other side of the bridge and left Chief Inspector Chen's sight in the morning light. In the morning light, Ding Ning slowly walked out of the room and into the courtyard. It wasn't an act. Even though he had received treatment from many famed doctors of Chongling, even though he had the 9-death silkworm and the heaven-replenishing divine art, killing palace attendant Rome and then Liang Lian exceeded his body's limits. If it weren't for the heaven-replenishing divine art, many of the hidden injuries in his body wouldn't have healed in this lifetime. They would only get worse and worse. When he stepped out of the eaves into the sunlight, Jing Liuli appeared at the gate of the courtyard. She also walked very slowly, and her expression was extremely tired. Even her legs were trembling slightly. Yi Jingnan, who had been standing at the entrance of the clinic, looked at Jing Liuli in shock, unable to understand. He could feel that Jing Liuli's breathing was very calm. The trembling of her legs was because she couldn't control the natural reaction of her muscles. Looks like you've seen a lot of battles tonight. Before Yi Zhengnan could react, Ding Ning looked at Jing Liuli and spoke. I only missed 2 of Mo Shoqing's swords. Jing Liuli nodded and said. Yi Zhengnan was shocked. He finally realized that last night, Jing Liuli had chased after Mo Shoqing's sword light, seen many of his swords, and many battles between grandmasters. I saw in Baoshi's sword. He is still stronger than me. After a pause, Jing Liuli looked at Ding Ning and said seriously. Both geniuses learn faster. The pursuer is always faster. You will quickly catch up to him. Ding Ning looked at her and said seriously, since many people have not seen as many battles between grandmasters as you will have great accomplishments when you return to Min Mountain Sword Sect to cultivate. Jing Liuli stilled slightly. From Ding Ning's calm words, she heard something extraordinary. She instinctively repeated, return to Min Mountain Sword Sect. You should be returning to Min Mountain Sword Sect immediately. Ding Ning looked at her and nodded. Jing Liuli could not understand and said, I still have to stay here to study. Ding Ning shook his head and said, your master will have you return. In the days she had studied with Ding Ning, Jing Liuli had undoubtedly improved greatly. Yi Zhengnan, who also heard these words, could not understand the meaning. Jing Liuli started to understand. Her expression grew ugly, and she said, what about you? The Yuezhi have submitted. Only the Wuji remain. If we conquer the Donghu, we will have no future troubles when fighting the Yin and Qi. Ding Ning naturally could not have heard the conversation between the Empress and Yuan Wu, but at this time, he said the exact same words. Then he looked at Jing Liuli and added, as to Chu, it seems she is never worried. This was the true situation of the world. Jing Liuli was still limited to Chongling and could not understand. So she bowed like an attendant again and said, please teach. Conquering so many cultivation places in one night and completely subduing all the cultivation places in Chongling. Next, we need to immediately move the cultivators of these cultivation places away to avoid future troubles. Only by moving these cultivators from one battle to another will these cultivators have new enemies. Only a war can satisfy all our needs. Ding Ning looked northwest and said with slight disdain, so if I have not guessed wrong, the Qin dynasty should be at war with the Wuji right now. The cultivators of these cultivation places in Chongling will be driven to the border to conquer the Wuji. Jing Liuli frowned. She was not angry and admired the Empress' decisiveness. You mean that Min Mountain Sword Sect will also accept the Empress orders, accept the conscription like these cultivation places, and then you will go to the Wuji border? She asked with a frown. Ding Ning shook his head and said, not just that. I will be sent to the Donghu border. Jing Liuli's frown deepened. Donghu? Donghu and the Wuji are intimately connected. Also, the Wuji and Donghu people are valiant. If Wuji is attacked, Donghu should not stay put. Even if they do not send out all their troops, they should at least secretly send some troops. The Qin dynasty will not be unprepared. Ding Ning looked at her and said, Donghu and the Chu and Qi border and are far from the Wuji border. There are too many variables in that place, and it is naturally more dangerous. Even the cultivators of Min Mountain Sword Sect may not have much control over that place. Jing Liuli's expression grew ugly. Do not think of stopping me. Ding Ning smiled slightly and said, I told you this specifically because I don't want you to do anything. Since I have already predicted this, I will naturally be fine. Jing Liuli lowered her head and thought for a moment. Then she looked up at Ding Ning with a strange gaze. So you want to leave Chongling? Ding Ning smiled and said, is it not what most cultivators seek to achieve? The more dangerous a place is, the easier it is to accumulate military merit. But you are not like the vast majority of cultivators. That is why your choice, as well as your flawless plan, made me feel that something was off. After Jing Liuli said this, she bowed deeply to Ding Ning and said, regardless of whether your prophecy comes true today, regardless of whether I am about to return to Min Mountain Sword Sect, thank you for teaching me these days. But in the future, I do not want you to become my enemy. Whether we become enemies or not may not be decided by our wills. Ding Ning said coolly, and then looked up at the path outside the door. On the road in the distance, there was some smoke and dust. A figure that was as big as a mountain of flesh appeared in their line of sight, bringing with it a terrifying pressure. This was Marquis Su of Mount Hung, one of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty. The one who appeared before him was a very handsome man in a green robe. This was Tantai Guanjian. "You want me to return to Min Mountain Sword Sect?" Jing Lioli asked directly when Tantai Guanjian passed through the gates. Tantai Guanjian stilled and nodded. "Ding Ning is staying and going to the border?" Jing Lioli looked at him and asked. Tantai Guanjian did not immediately answer or deny. After a pause, he said, "This depends on the Empress' decree." Jing Lioli did not look at his expression. He turned to look at Ding Ning and said, "You guessed correctly." Ding Ning glanced at Tantai Guanjian and said, "I need to take some people with me, and I need a day or two to prepare." Tantai Guanjian did not hesitate this time and said apologetically in a soft voice, "This is not a problem." Chapter 4:23. In the morning light, when the mountainous Marquis Su walked into Ding Ning's clinic, many people in Chongling were looking up at the turrets in Chongling. After this night, they finally discovered the strength of this old man. They discovered that this old man may be the strongest cultivator in Chongling, second only to the Yuanwu Emperor. But when most of them looked at the turrets in the morning light, their gazes were filled with hatred and awe. Very few people could come into contact with this old man, so very few people could understand this old man's mind. This was especially so for those who were still alive in the cultivation grounds that they had been forced to submit to. They only remembered how many people this old man had killed in one night, how many people they were familiar with and even respected had died in this old man's hands. "Teacher, I cannot find any clues to the 9-death silkworm." In the morning light, Huang Jinwei climbed up the turret again. When he reached the highest point of the turret, he looked at the old man sitting on the rattan chair. After one night, he had aged beyond words. His eyes were filled with pain. "Now I'm thinking, did you purposely give me such hope so that I won't stay by your side and stop you? The 9-death silkworm is too meticulous. How can someone like me find it?" Hearing his words, Emo Shoching laughed and then said seriously, "Do not belittle yourself. You are my student." Even the cold general standing behind him knew that these words were the greatest praise. All of Chongling knew that Mo Shoching had only taken 2 students. One was the Yuanwu Emperor in his early years, and then Huang Jinwei. "Now, there is no meaning in doubting me or yourself." Mo Shoching slowly looked up. As he did so, another crack seemed to appear in the sky. Another enormous power fell towards a certain part of Chongling. Huang Jinwei smelled blood. Mo Shoching's attack had landed too far away. Even though there were waves of blood like last night, Huang Jinwei could not smell the blood there. The scent of blood came from Mo Shoching's body, from the wrinkles on his face. True blood flowed out of Mo Shoching's wrinkles. His face looked as if it had been slashed by many swords, as if the sword intent of those grandmasters from last night had finally landed on his body. Huang Jinwei stared at the scene in the morning light. He opened his mouth wide like a fish dying of thirst and struggled to breathe. However, he could neither breathe nor speak. The light in Mo Shoching's eyes dimmed slightly, but his expression did not change. Another powerful aura was released from his body, causing the blood flowing from the wrinkles on his face to drip out. "No!" Huang Jinwei could clearly sense something, and he finally cried out. "This sword must be completed in the end," Mo Shoching said calmly, and then spat out a mouthful of blood. Blood splattered on his chest. The sword essence in the sky formed completely and fell down. As the sword essence fell, his body lay limply on the rattan chair behind him. The wrinkles on his face reached deep into his bones, and the remaining white hair on his head fell off. He was like a candle flame that burned to ashes in the end. At the place where Mo Shoching's last sword essence had landed, some officials of the Martial Bureau were standing behind a group of soldiers waiting in formation. When the sword essence fell, a high wall in front of the army was suddenly cut. Behind the crack in the wall, a bloody mist rose. The expressions of these martial sector officials relaxed slightly. At this time, a military order was passed to these officials. Min Mountain's sword sect agreed. That wine shop you've calmly accepted? Just now, the officials' expressions were relaxed, but now they were both happy and shocked. One of the officials inexplicably felt sympathy for Ding Ning, who the people of Chongling called the wine shop youth. He looked up towards the northwest. At the end of the Qin dynasty's territory was a wasteland that had no end in sight. Even though the heat of Chongling had not dissipated, the grass and trees there were covered in frost and turning white. In the thick cold, large groups of cavalry shouted in strange voices and came like the wind. They hunted the beasts in the plains, and did not even let go of the seeds of some wild grasses. For these Donghu people, this was harvest. The vast grasslands had enough space for them to harvest and give them food and clothing. But for some of the armies of the Qin dynasty, the battlefield these Donghu people passed through meant a sweep. There were not many cultivators among the Donghu people, but they had many strange weapons similar to weapons that could kill cultivators. Even more importantly, supplies and some chariots could not keep up with the Donghu people's footsteps. Also, it was difficult for reinforcements to arrive. At least in the past, the armies of the Qin dynasty had not had experience fighting the Donghu people, and had not had many experiences of victory. At this time, these officials of the Martial Bureau were considering that since the crazy mistress of the imperial palace dared to make such a decision, this meant that Ding Ning's situation would be more dangerous than most of the border armies there. So no one felt that it was wrong for Ding Ning to take some people to Donghu. Min Mountain Sword Sect, the mountain mist parted. In the green palace used for recuperation, Xie Chongqing opened a letter. With just a cursory glance, his happy face was immediately filled with anger. Then he could not help but shout, "Ding Ning, what do you mean by this? You let Nangong Kaishu go with you to Donghu, but not me. Do you look down on me, or do you think my sister is dead and have thoughts about Nangong Kaishu?" His angry voice echoed in the green hall. The honest Min Mountain Sword Sect teacher who had been staying in the green hall frowned, but in the next moment he stilled. "Come quickly, I want to leave Min Mountain Sword Sect." When Xie Chongqing shouted for the second time, this Min Mountain Sword Sect teacher dressed in green robes appeared in his sight. "You really want to leave Min Mountain Sword Sect?" Even though he was certain he had heard correctly, this Min Mountain Sword Sect teacher was still stunned. "He does not let me go to the Donghu border, but can I not go?" Xie Chongqing sneered loudly. "Do you think I can't go?" No one in Min Mountain Sword Sect stopped Xie Chongqing, because Xie Chongqing was not a student of Min Mountain Sword Sect. But everyone was used to forgetting that he was here. The 2 or 3 days Ding Ning wanted were just to heal and wait for some people. In Chongling, he was just an ordinary wine shop youth and had nothing to prepare. A fast horse appeared in his sight. On the back of the horse was a travel-worn but heroic young woman. This young woman was Nangong Kaishu, who had angered Xie Chongqing. After the Min Mountain Sword trials, Nangong Kaishu and Ding Ning had not met yet. In this period of time, Ding Ning had done many astounding things. While the time was short, it seemed many years had passed. On the way here, Nangong Kaishu had been thinking about what it would be like to see Ding Ning again. But inexplicably, when she saw Ding Ning dressed and waiting for her, she immediately thought of that day outside Min Mountain Sword Sect, when Shui Wangshu had died. Her nose felt sore, and she could not help but feel proud of Ding Ning. When she got off the horse, she suppressed her tears and forced out a smile. She said, "Ding Ning, I am really proud of you. I only did my best to do what I wanted to do." Ding Ning smiled and said, "I dragged down many people." Nangong Kaishu said, "This is my choice. You have not been in Min Mountain Sword Sect for long, but you have become much older." Ding Ning looked at Nangong Kaishu and smiled. But then he quickly put away his smile and said softly, "Do you know why I want you to come with me to Donghu?" Nangong Kaishu shook her head. Ding Ning looked at her and said seriously, "Because I asked Marquis Su of Mount Hung some things. He told me that your father will be an important general of the Donghu border army." Nangong Kaishu stilled. Ding Ning continued, I think that maybe it is because you and I are friends that the Empress transferred him over. So I think that if you are with him, you will feel more at ease. Nangon Kaishu took a deep breath and nodded. Then she smiled faintly. No matter the result, I should thank you for being able to fight in Father's army as a soldier. I want to know Min Mountain Sword sex arrangements for other people. Ding Ning looked at her and asked. Chapter 424. Min Mountain Sword Sect has no plans for other people. Nangon Kaishu looked at Ding Ning and shook her head. She said, if not for your request, even I would have been left behind to cultivate in Min Mountain Sword Sect. Ding Ning did not seem surprised. After a moment of thought, he said with satisfaction, Min Mountain Sword Sect has shown an attitude that the Empress is satisfied with. This is the Empress repayment. Nangon Kaishu understood Ding Ning's meaning and said, you worry that she will treat us like she treated Zhang Yi? Separating friends and family is what she is best at, Ding Ning said with a cold smile. Nangon Kaishu stilled slightly. She thought of Ding Ning killing palace attendant Rome. This was also a repayment to the Empress for punishing Zhang Yi. To be able to have Xie Changxing stay in Min Mountain Sword Sect, and he seems to have had many seriously injured students stay in Min Mountain Sword Sect. After a sneer, Ding Ning looked at Nangon Kaishu and said, Bailey Sushu has changed. Nangon Kaishu felt that she could not casually comment on people of this level like Ding Ning, so she could not respond. Min Mountain was cold at the top. Bailey Sushua looked at the snow and slowly asked a Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator dressed in indigo robes behind him. He has no other requests? The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator shook his head respectfully and said, other than asking for those people to accompany him, he did not make any other requests. Bailey Sushua said coolly, he did not make any requests. This means that he is confident. The Min Mountain Sword Sect cultivator standing respectfully was slightly discontent. He said, we are allowing the Empress to do as she pleases. Turning hostile when there is no need to can only be called rashness. Bailey Sushua said expressionlessly, no matter how unified, there will be a few swords that she and Yuanwu will be wary of. Why fight to the death? For many people in Chongling, the place colder than Min Mountain snow was the depths of the Imperial Palace. Deep in the Imperial Palace, on the stone path in front of the Emperor's study, a man in gray robes knelt. He was very tall. Even though he was kneeling on the ground, he still looked very tall. However, the place where his right arm used to be was empty, and a section of his sleeve was swaying slightly in the wind. He looked desolate and humble. No one could connect him to the master of the great floating water prison, Xinxian. He did not know how long he had been kneeling. A cold voice finally came from the front of the study. I only asked you to come and see me. Why are you kneeling? Xinxian looked at the ground in front of his knees. Without raising his head, he said, the great floating water prison was broken. Losing Lin Jujio is my fault. I have come to receive punishment. If you have a clear conscience and have done your best, there is no need for you to kneel. The Empress' voice continued to ring out from the study. Hearing this cold and authoritative voice, Xinxian did not argue and just bowed his head in silence. I thought you liked the great floating water prison. The Empress continued, you can meet more cultivators there, and you can learn a lot of cultivation methods from them. That's why your cultivation has been progressing very quickly over the years. Do not forget, among those of your age, there are many cultivators who are more talented than you, but are far behind you. But now, I know you do not like it, not as you show. If my judgment is wrong, it is naturally my fault, and not your fault. You should know, unless I do not speak, if I speak, I will do what I say. I can give you a promise. The voice from the study was not so cold and started to calm. If you like, you can go with the army to Donghu. If you can take the heaven-replenishing divine art from that youth, you will be the 14th Marquis of the Qin dynasty, and I can let you choose your land. Xinxian's body did not tremble at all, but the muscles on his face started to twitch slightly. He took a deep breath and then slowly stood up. He said, I will go to Donghu. The Empress' voice sounded from the study. She said, "I hope you truly like it this time." Xinxian looked up and said, "I truly like it." Chongling was always a place filled with sorrow and joy. Some people liked it, and some were sad. Huang Jinwei looked sorrowfully at Emo Shoqing, who was lying quietly on the rattan chair. He said in a trembling voice, "Teacher, wait for me." Emo Shoqing slowly looked up, glanced at him, and nodded. Huang Jinwei turned and walked down the turret. He walked towards the imperial palace in the morning light. He knew his teacher was in his last moments. How long he would stay in this world depended only on his teacher's wishes. If he was to leave, his teacher would leave this world at any time. He knew that with his teacher's current state, every minute he stayed was more pain. But he wanted his teacher to wait for him to return from the imperial palace. He wanted to ask the empress for some things. At least his teacher would not be like the master of the Shang family back then. At least his teacher would have less of a bad reputation. This was his most sincere wish as a student. He wanted to do this, but he did not know that when he left the turret, under Emo Shoqing's signal, the cold general turned his rattan chair so that Emo Shoqing could see Huang Jinwei in the distance. What is the meaning? Emo Shoqing seemed to be speaking to Huang Jinwei, but also to himself and the cold general behind him. When you live to my old age, you will understand that there is nothing more important than life and death and following one's heart. When one is dead, everything is empty. If one can have peace of mind, why would one care about the matters after death? After saying this, he covered himself with the blanket and closed his eyes as though he was taking a nap. Huang Jinwei walked quickly. He was like a patch of morning light moving through Chongling. At a certain place, he paused for a moment. From this place, he could see a deserted street not far away. That street was Falling Parasol. He did not think of anything else about the wine shop youth. He only thought of the youth standing in front of the dead Shui Wangshu before the Min Mountain sword trials started. In the scene in his mind, his and Ding Ning's figures gradually overlapped. He thought of how his mood right now was Ding Ning's mood at the time. He paused for a moment and then continued to walk. Then he quickly stopped again. With his cultivation, he could hear many minute sounds. Usually, he was used to the sounds of all beings in the world entering his ears. Then he would naturally filter out the chaotic sounds and hear what he wanted to hear. The sounds he naturally heard were the sounds he wanted to hear. His body inexplicably trembled. It was because the voices he unconsciously heard right now were just ordinary conversations between two people on the street. Blacksmith Zhang's daughter is growing prettier. She looks exactly like her mother when she was young. They are carved from the same mold. Your mouth is clearly more similar to Blacksmith Zhang's. I think you're old and can't remember clearly. Even if it is a painting drawn by the same artist, two people cannot be exactly the same. Your personality is too honest. Hearing such ordinary conversations that would often occur on the streets, Huang Jinwei knew he had made a serious mistake, or rather, he had overlooked something. Sometimes, clues that he had searched for a long time without any clues had already entered his eyes like weeds on the side of the road. Many people had investigated Ding Ning. Back when Yi Sealing returned to Chongling and the storm, the Divinity Bureau had carefully investigated Ding Ning, including his aunt Zhongsun Qinxue. Even though the Divinity Bureau did not find any problems and even destroyed Ding Ning's files, some of the truly powerful people who wanted to investigate Ding Ning would get as much information as the Divinity Bureau. After the Deer Mountain Conference, Huang Jinwei had seen some of Ding Ning's information. Ding Ning's information naturally included Zhongsun Qinxue. There were no problems with Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue's backgrounds. He had even seen Ding Ning and Zhongsun Qinxue's genealogy records. In the genealogy records, there was a portrait of Zhongsun Qinxue's mother. In the genealogy records, Zhongsun Qinxue's mother was almost identical to Zhongsun Qinxue. Not just the appearance, but even their expressions were the same. There were no two identical rivers in the world, and no two people with the same appearance. This was the simplest principle. Yet when he flipped through the genealogy records, he did not make a serious comparison in his mind. He only thought that Zhongsun Qinxue's mother was a peerless beauty with an unforgettable appearance. If the portrait was drawn according to Zhongsun Qinxue, then it was fake. Faking was the biggest problem. Chapter 425. After a simple and overlooked question, there were countless questions. But if one thought understood, then all would be understood. When one did not think about the process and just confirmed one point, these countless questions could be explained. Why was Ding Ning's cultivation so fast? Why was Ding Ning able to travel with forefather Zhou and survive? Why was Ding Ning able to understand countless sword manuals at a glance? Why was Ding Ning so serious? Why was Ding Ning able to fight above his cultivation level? In this moment, there seemed to be countless people chanting in Huang Jinwei's mind, all of them reciting Ding Ning's name and the words 9 Death Silkworm. His body sank into the increasingly bright morning light. He found it increasingly absurd and laughable, and almost cried. Was life so laughable? When he searched everywhere, but found nothing, when everything had happened, it had silently appeared in front of him. A black feather gently floated down in the light. Trembling, Huang Jinwei looked up. He had never found the sun so blinding. He saw a black pigeon fly over from the direction of the imperial palace. The black pigeon carried the Empress' decree. He was on his way back to the imperial palace, but the Empress' decree had already arrived. He took down the letter tube from the pigeon's leg and opened the sealed secret letter to the bureau leaders. Then his hands trembled even more violently. At this time, he heard the sound of a bugle from a distant turret behind him. His body stiffened as he turned around, only to see a pair of white pants. He was Mo Shouqing's only student after the Yuanwu Emperor. He naturally knew what the bugle from the turret and the white line meant. He knew that his teacher had not fulfilled his promise to him in the end. Or rather, his teacher was wiser than him and could see further. He knew that even if he went to the imperial palace, he could not change anything. "Teacher!" he shouted in pain, completely ignoring the gazes of the people around him. Glowing tears flowed down his face. Nothing would change. Teacher was dead. The Empress' decree had been given. He wanted to let his teacher know, when he was alive, that some bad reputation would not be placed on him. He should receive some of the glory that he deserved. However, it was impossible for the teacher to see it. Whatever he wanted to do, it was impossible for him to succeed. After his teacher's death, there would be a lot of accusations and anger for his teacher to bear. In his final moments, he knew that his teacher had chosen to accept everything calmly. All of his efforts were for the sake of an incomparably glorious and enormous empire in the future, an empire that had never been seen before. However, he couldn't accept it. The only voice that rang out in his mind was the words his teacher had said to him. The only thing he could do now was to make a choice. Huang Jinwei stood in the middle of the street. Some of his subordinates didn't want others to see him lose his composure, so they cleared the street. But as he stood on this empty street, the scene before his eyes kept changing. He seemed to be standing in front of the huge pile of corpses from back then. He saw the invincible swordsman who had led the Qin dynasty forward and destroyed 3 dynasties. In the end, he died, his body ground to dust by countless sword lights. In the end, not even ashes were left. He seemed to be standing in front of the Bazin Kindo ground again. The enormous Ba mountain range was so tall that he couldn't see its peak. It pressed down on him like a divine world, making him feel so small he couldn't breathe. Yet when the last flower sword finally broke and the Bazin Kindo ground disappeared, he felt the enormous Ba mountain suddenly collapse, and countless shadows pressed down on him. Many people had given their entire lives to this growing dynasty until their deaths. Yet they did not receive what they deserved. The moment Huang Jinwei faced a choice, he thought of the gaze of that person in the center of the enormous pile of corpses before he died. Was there anyone who was wrong? Was the 9 Death Silkworm wrong? Huang Jinwei closed his eyes even more painfully. However, the blazing sunlight still reflected a patch of red in front of his eyes. All choices came from the true emotions in the heart. He completely understood the meaning of his teacher's words. His teacher had made the choice he thought was right and liked. But his teacher would not stop him from making a choice. Because he was his teacher, the disciple he truly doted on. He closed his eyes forcefully. Then he pressed his lips together and gritted his teeth. Because he used too much force, Blood flowed between his teeth and dripped down the corner of his mouth, but he did not realize it. When he made his choice, Ding Ning was calmly preparing his luggage. He had already notified the warden's office. Usually, any cultivator without military merit would be an ordinary soldier when they entered the army. But because of his special status, and because he had come from the compromise of Min Mountain Sword sect, he received treatment like an ordinary general. The warden's office sent 3 carriages to welcome him on his journey. Because he did not return to Garden, there was no farewell. Other than the 3 carriage drivers from the warden's office and a servant girl who did some menial work, there was only him, Zhang Sun Qinxue, Nangang Kaishu, and Yi Jingnan. This kind of farewell might appear bleak, but leaving the city like this meant great relief for Ding Ning. Any side issues that arose would naturally make him unhappy. So when he prepared to board the warden's office carriage and saw the youth who appeared in his sight, his expression turned cold like it was covered in a layer of frost. Nangang Kaishu was originally from a family of generals. She had seen many things like this before. She had taken care of all the things that needed to be brought. The 3 coachmen of the warden's office were full of admiration. At this time, she was inspecting some prepared medicines. The moment she sensed an unusual presence, she turned to look. And Baosher. The moment she saw the youth, she softly asked Ding Ning who was nearby. This young man wasn't very tall, but the feeling he gave people was taller than any of the young talents Nangang Kaishu had seen before. Even Jing Lioli did not give her such a strong feeling. Ding Ning had never formally seen in Baosher before, but he knew that this youth who seemed to be floating in the air could only be in Baosher. "I have come to tell you some things." Without any opening words or etiquette, and Baosher walked dozens of feet from Ding Ning and stopped. He looked at Ding Ning with a smile and said, "Jing Lioli has been defeated by me." Ding Ning looked at him and did not speak. "Now, you are my only opponent. I hope that you will not slack off after winning against Palace Attendant Rome." And Baosher looked at Ding Ning with a smile and said, "And I will probably go to the Donghu border. You feel that I will slack off?" Ding Ning looked at Baosher and asked in response. And Baosher smiled and said, "It is good that you will not." Nangang Kaishu and Yi Jingnan frowned at the same time and were displeased. Their displeasure was not because of Baosher's pride and arrogance, but because of Ding Ning's response. They felt that Ding Ning's response was too weak and did not have the sharpness of Ding Ning in the past. But at this time, Ding Ning said, "What does my slacking off have to do with you?" And Baosher stilled slightly. "Your opponent is Jing Lioli." Ding Ning stopped looking at Baosher and started to board the carriage. He said, "Jing Lioli will naturally defeat you and does not need me." And Baosher frowned deeply. But he did not say anything else and said softly, "Since this is the case, then we will meet at the Donghu border." Nangang Kaishu laughed. She started to board the carriage and then said seriously to Baosher, "Do not keep mentioning the Donghu border. You should know that this is still a secret of the warden's office." And Baosher did not care about this kind of provocation. He smiled slightly and turned to leave. The 3 carriages started to move and leave Chongling. Chapter 426. At the end of the summer in the 12th year of the Qin dynasty, the Qin dynasty and Wuji had a conflict on the border. The cause of the conflict was a drinking bowl, but a soldier of the Qin dynasty died for this toilet bowl. That night, the Qin dynasty's border army requested Wuji to hand over the Wuji warrior who had killed the Qin dynasty soldier. Yet Wuji emphasized that the Qin dynasty soldier had crossed the border. Yet the Qin dynasty's border army believed that this was the drinking bowl of the Qin army, and that soldiers' legitimate request had not received a response. So after their request was rejected, the Qin dynasty's border army took decisive measures. A border army decisively attacked the Wuji warriors' base. This conflict grew in intensity in the following days. As the Qin dynasty continued to increase their troops, it quickly became a war. Yet those in the future who calculated the time would easily find that on the same day that soldier died for drinking a bowl, many of the Qin dynasty's troops had started to cross the Yin mountain and move towards the Wuji border. Many Chongling cultivators had set off that night towards the cold and desolate place that the Qin people considered a wasteland. In the view of those who studied war in the future, the Qin dynasty had grasped a good opportunity. The closest to Wuji were the Yuezhi and Western Chang. The Yuezhi had become a vassal state of the Qin dynasty long ago. After the war started, the Yuezhi army directly joined the war against Wuji. Western Chang had just experienced an internal conflict. Multiple princes had worked together to kill the old Wang, but their mother had led the old Wang's former subordinates to attack them one by one. Now, the powerful mother had become the true leader of Western Chang, but she did not have the power to send troops to help Wuji. At the end of the summer in the 12th year of the Qin dynasty's Yuanwu year, Ding Ning was one of the many Chongling cultivators heading for the Yin Mountain. Cultivators who had never participated in war, regardless of their cultivation, were new recruits and were escorted by the conscription officers of the warden's office. The military order of the Qin dynasty was extremely strict. If there was a delay, even the conscription officer would be stripped of his military merit and be demoted to hard labor. If there was a serious delay, even the conscription officer would be executed. Therefore, the troops transporting the new recruits were not only escorting them, but they were also escorting them like prisoners. They had a mission that they had to deliver. Because it was wartime, the conscription officers from Chongling were generals that had to be sent to the border. Ding Ning's army was part of the Imperial Guard stationed 130 miles outside Chongling. There were 2,000 people in this army, but they carried large amounts of iron and bronze wares, which were tools used by the border army for normal daily use and for reclaiming land. Like many previous dynasties, the Qin dynasty had strict control over the metal tools that could be used to make powerful weapons. Most of the workshops were gathered in Chongling. When it was wartime, everything would flow out with the army. While it used up a lot of manpower and resources, this created a benefit. The orders would be received, and the Qin dynasty's army reacted quickly. The highest commander of this army was called Guofeng. He was from Guangzhou and was old acquaintances with Nangong Caishu's father. He was also very respectful of Ding Ning. When Ding Ning and the others were picked up outside Chongling and the troops started to depart, he immediately invited Ding Ning and Nangong Caishu onto his chariot. Many people in Chongling have heard many things about you. This general was not tall, even slightly stooped. He was slightly bald, but he still gave off the steely presence of a soldier who had experienced countless battles. He bowed respectfully to Ding Ning, and his tone was extremely humble. Especially when I heard how you refused Li Lingjun and helped that gangster called Wang Taishu become the leader of Chongling's underworld. So I know that your strength is not just in your cultivation or your ability to fight across realms, but also in your foresight and scheming. Ding Ning was not a humble person and did not know how to say polite words. So when he heard the general's words, he bowed seriously and said, "I am too wounded and fear I cannot contribute much in battle. If there is anything I can help General Guo along the way, you can ask." Guofeng was very satisfied with his attitude and admired Ding Ning even more. So he smiled and said, "You should be my strategist, of course, just helping along the way." After a pause, he immediately put away his smile and said slowly, "The journey is too long, and you are too famous. I fear the journey will not be peaceful." Ding Ning glanced at this ordinary-looking general and said, "General is a smart person. What do you think about the Qin dynasty's campaign against Wuji this time?" Guofeng did not speak modestly and asked Ding Ning, "The key is the attitude of the Chu dynasty across the Yin Mountain from Wuji. Neither Western Chang nor Donghu can change Wuji's fate." Ding Ning smiled disdainfully and said, "Such a great commotion. Even your Imperial Guard army has been sent out. Many cultivators have been sent out of Chongling. How can they be satisfied if they do not take down Wuji?" Guofeng nodded and said, "I agree with your view." Ding Ning looked at him and said, "Donghu will naturally send troops. Donghu is not just tied to Wuji. Most of Donghu's metal and bone weapons come from Wuji. If Wuji belongs to the Qin dynasty, if they do not have border trade in a decade, Donghu will not even have enough weapons. But regardless of whether Donghu sends troops or Chu passes through the Yin Mountain, the journey will be long. So Wuji will not quickly have a final battle with the Qin dynasty and will delay. The reason the Qin dynasty set up a border city behind the Yin Mountain is because Donghu used to be called the barbarians of the desert. They are most skilled in cavalry attacks. If they want to chase, the Qin army will have a hard time catching up. After the Yin Mountain, I fear it will snow in a month. No matter what, they will delay until after the snow. Guofeng's eyes flashed violently. He had thought of some things, but not as thoroughly as Ding Ning. Even more importantly, he felt that Ding Ning's words were very reasonable. However, I believe that the Empress has already considered this point. That's why any army would bring so many things. Ding Ning slowly turned around and looked at the escorting carriages. He said, so she will not be in a rush, and will let the other drag it out until after the snow. This choice will result in fewer casualties, but after a long time, it will be difficult to endure. Also, for a small army, there are too many variables. Guofeng took a deep breath and looked seriously at Ding Ning. In the end, we will all go to Donghu. There, we should all belong to a small army. Ding Ning laughed and said, after we reach Donghu, it will be like this. Before we reach Donghu, I fear that just like General thinks, we will be bait. Guofeng did not seem surprised by the words, but his expression grew colder. General, you said that I am too famous and cultivate too quickly. For the other 3 dynasties, I am a great threat. Ding Ning said coolly, General, there are not enough powerful cultivators in this army. So for people who want to assassinate me, they will not have to pay a great price. Since you see more clearly than me, this means you have the ability to remind me to react in time. Guofeng looked at the road ahead and said slowly, my duty is not just to transport you to your destination on time, but to do my best to let the men who came with me return home. Chapter 427. The transmission of information always needed time. Even in Chongling, no one dared to intercept the black pigeons or black hawks flying out of the imperial palace. But there were many steps involved in the writing, transmission, and handling of secret messages, and they all took more time. Just like how the Empress predicted the change in the great floating water prison, but still lost to the 9-death silkworm because of the time difference. One of the most important reasons for her madness was because she tasted the betrayal of the people around her. Some major events in Chongling would take many days to reach the other dynasties. When the powerful forces coming down from the turrets took the lives of many cultivators in Chongling, and then sent groups of cultivators to the Wuji border in the distant capital of the Yin dynasty, they just learned of what had happened in Chongling many days ago. In a lecture hall of Celestial Seal Sect, Zhang Yi sat on the last straw mat. He was used to sitting in the worst position because he did not understand most of the Seal Path truths that the Celestial Seal Sect teachers were talking about. If he could not keep up in one place, he could not keep up everywhere. He was used to the disdainful gazes of his classmates. This disdain was not just because of his terrible progress, but because he came from the Qin. When the Qin dynasty started to destroy the Han, Zhao, and Wei, the other dynasties in the world had great enmity towards the Qin. Especially after the Deer Mountain Conference, the Qin dynasty was recognized as the enemy of the other 3 dynasties. For the young people of the Yin dynasty, even if this person could not stay in the Qin and came to the Yin, a Qin person was a Qin person and could become an enemy in the future. But today, Zhang Yi found that his classmates looked at him differently than usual. Even the teacher of this Seal Path lesson looked at him differently than usual. Zhang Yi could not keep up with the lesson. Coupled with the uneasiness of not knowing what was going on, Zhang Yi became even more confused. At the end of the lesson, this teacher asked Zhang Yi a question that was very simple for the other students, but Zhang Yi still could not answer. Many people could not understand how Zhang Yi had been able to enter. This instructor was also one of the people who didn't understand. He looked at the ashamed and speechless Zhang Yi. He shook his head and asked another question. You cannot even answer such a simple question. Then, do you know what your junior sect brother Ding Ning did in Chongling? Zhang Yi was stunned for a moment, but he no longer lowered his head in shame. Instead, He subconsciously raised his head to look at the instructor and asked anxiously, "My junior brother Ding Ning, his cultivation has reached Realm 5. He is the fastest cultivator to reach Realm 5 in the history of the cultivation world." This celestial talisman sect disciple looked at Zhang Yi and said after a pause, after he reached Realm 5, he immediately challenged the palace attendant of the Empress, who was near the peak of Realm 6. "You must have seen that palace attendant when you attended the Min Mountain Sword Trials." Then he succeeded. In a fair duel, he killed that palace attendant. The other students in the classroom clearly knew of this matter, but their gazes when they looked at Zhang Yi contained more emotions. But when he heard the words, Zhang Yi's entire body shook, and even his lips started to tremble. "Teacher, this..." He was so surprised that he couldn't say a complete sentence for a moment. The heavens gather in Chongling. The top cultivation geniuses recognized by the world in recent years have all come from Chongling. But why are the young geniuses of White Goat Cave so different? One is unreachable, the other. This instructor said a few words, but was unable to control his anger. He waved his sleeves and directly left the lecture hall. This instructor managed to suppress his last vicious words. But what difference did it make whether he said it or not? No one comforted Zhang Yi. Most of the people looked at Zhang Yi with disgust in their eyes. At this time, Zhang Yi did not seem to feel any shame, but joy and relief. No matter how outstanding he was, that was someone else's matter. So what if he was a junior sect brother? Maybe this person was born too weak and would not become a talent. A beautiful young woman stood up, looked with disgust at Zhang Yi, and prepared to leave the classroom. This young woman was not the best of the students in the classroom, nor was she the one with the highest cultivation or the strongest comprehension. But her status was the noblest. She was Murong Xiaoi, her aunt, and the present empress of the Yin dynasty. Among the imperial relatives in the empress's clan, she was favored the most by the Yin empress. From a certain point of view, her status was no different from the Yin princess. Also, the Yin empress only had 3 imperial sons and did not even have a real princess. Because of this status, she was usually the second to leave after the instructors left, and then the others. Her likes and dislikes could often influence the likes and dislikes of many other people in this group of students. When she stood and moved, not looking at Zhang Yi, many other students also stood up and did not look at Zhang Yi. But at this time, a clear bell sounded in the mountains. Murong Xiaoi stilled. In her memory, she had never heard such a bell sound in Celestial Seal sect. The students who followed her out of the classroom were very surprised. Then they quickly received an answer from the instructors. Someone was charging into the mountain. For a sect, someone charging into the mountain meant a public challenge. But this was Celestial Seal sect, the strongest sect in the Yin dynasty. Who had the guts? Who had the ability to publicly challenge Celestial Seal sect? There was no need to ask. The direction of the crowd was naturally the direction of the challenger. The people in Celestial Seal sect flowed towards the entrance of Celestial Seal sect at the foot of the mountain. Just like usual, Zhang Yi followed at the back of this group of students. He was very surprised, shocked that his little sect brother dared to do such a thing, and overjoyed that his little sect brother did such a thing. He was proud of his little sect brother, but not many people felt his sadness. This was the Yin. No one had seen how Shui Wangshu died before the Min Mountain Sword Trial started, so no one could understand his emotions. As a result, when he unconsciously followed to see the spectacle, he was still in a joyful and sad mood, unable to extricate himself. He was still thinking about when he could return to Chongling and burn incense at Shui Wangshu's grave, and when he could see his little sect brother. A tide of gasps sounded at the entrance and spread backwards like a wave. Zhang Yi suddenly woke up. Not far in front of him, even Murong Xiaoi made a sound of disbelief. No one had expected that the public challenger that many teachers of Celestial Seal sect placed great importance on was a youth about the same age as them. This youth was not tall and had an ordinary appearance. His complexion was slightly sallow, as though he had lived a hard life. He wore ordinary blue cloth robes and black cloth shoes. He looked slightly restrained, but stood firmly at the gates of Celestial Seal sect. Who was this person? Murong Xiaoyi's status was extraordinary, and she naturally could not just make friends with people who had entered the sect with her. When she spoke, a young Celestial Seal sect cultivator, who seemed to be a teacher, was standing next to her. He answered softly, "A cultivator of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect." Yellow Heaven Taoist sect? Murong Xiaoyi and her good friends stilled when they heard the answer. In their impression, this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect was a small sect that was not famous. Senior sect Brother Feng, he was seriously injured by his attack. This young Celestial Seal sect cultivator swallowed with difficulty and then said, "Yellow Heaven Taoist sect and Celestial Seal sect have some grievances." Chapter 428. At the end of this summer, when large groups of Chongling cultivators were heading out of the pass, Celestial Seal sect of the Yin Xanadu welcomed its first challenger since its founding. This challenger was a youth who looked cautious and inexperienced. He was a disciple of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. Facing the crowd of Celestial Seal sect disciples, he still had that cautious but uneasy expression. Most of the students of Celestial Seal sect, and even some of the older teachers, did not know of the connection between Yellow Heaven Taoist sect and Celestial Seal sect before this youth came, much less the grievances. Many old people had even forgotten about this story until this young man appeared. The founding master of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect was actually a disciple of Celestial Seal sect. That disciple was called Yamcha. He had been one of the best disciples of Celestial Seal sect back then, so good that he felt that the position of sect master of Celestial Seal sect could only be his. Yet he found that he was wrong. In the same generation of Celestial Seal sect cultivators, there was a disciple called Su Jingma who was much stronger than him. Later, this disciple called Su Jingma became the sect master of Celestial Seal sect. Yamcha spent a long time and found that he could not win against Su Jingma. Later, he left Celestial Seal sect and founded Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. Su Jingma was the previous sect master of Celestial Seal sect. It had been more than 100 years. Most people in Celestial Seal sect who knew of this story did not know why Yamcha had left Celestial Seal sect back then and founded Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. But in the end, Yellow Heaven Taoist sect was not successful. They had never produced any outstanding disciples. Even when Yamcha was present, they were unknown. But now, as this youth spoke, everyone in Celestial Seal sect understood why Yamcha had left Celestial Seal sect to found Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. Your Grandmaster and my Grandmaster said, even if my Grandmaster cannot win against him, as long as a student can win against a student, or a disciple can win against his disciple's student, it is the same. This cautious youth looked at the increasing number of Celestial Seal sect cultivators watching, but no one was in charge. He raised his head in slight irritation and said, "If we win, Celestial Seal sect will give the mountain to Earthly Heaven sect." Celestial Seal sect cannot ignore the words of the two Grandmasters. When this Yellow Heaven Taoist sect youth's voice clearly passed through Celestial Seal sect, the empty space in front of the mountain gates and the mountain path behind them were in an uproar. Zhang Yi was stunned for a moment before he finally reacted. Yamcha should have been unconvinced his entire life and was extremely proud. He had failed in the competition to become the master of Celestial Seal sect, but he was even more proud to create his own sect. In the future, he would place his sect above Celestial Seal sect. While they came from the same sect, if Yellow Heaven Taoist sect obtained the mountain of Celestial Seal sect, even if they did not have many people for the cultivation world, Yellow Heaven Taoist sect would become the orthodox sect, and Celestial Seal sect would become the outer sect of Yellow Heaven Taoist sect. Yamcha was like this. But the previous ancestral master of Celestial Seal sect, Su Jingma, was likely even more proud and confident than Yamcha. So he left behind such words. Even if Yamcha's student could win against his student, he would give up the mountain of Celestial Seal sect. It has been too long since you came to ask for the mountain of Celestial Seal sect, a generation apart. A wave of scornful voices sounded. These scornful voices came from Celestial Seal sect youths similar to Yamcha. It is the same no matter how long it has been. Celestial Seal sect do not deny it. Facing these mocking voices, this youth carefully took out a very old brocade pouch from his bosom. He didn't get angry, only arguing with reason. The ancestors of our two sects left behind a written pledge. Looking at this youth's clumsy and inexperienced appearance, many young Celestial Seal sect students forgot that this youth had charged into the mountain and wounded a senior sect brother. They laughed coldly. So, what if there is a written pledge? Do you feel you can win against all the Celestial Seal sect disciples of this generation? But this youth was still not angry. He looked up at the sneering Celestial Seal sect youths and nodded seriously. He answered seriously, yes. He still looked clumsy. The scene was inexplicably silent. Murong Xiaoyi frowned deeply. She was not angry, just thinking, if that senior sect brother Feng Yu was not a match for this youth, if the sect master agreed to this youth's challenge, then how many of the Celestial Seal sect disciples of this generation could win against this youth? The scene was silent. Many teachers present did not speak. This meant that these teachers were waiting for the sect master and the elders of Celestial Seal sect to speak. Those who speak must keep their word, no matter how many generations have passed. Since the ancestral master spoke, he will keep his word. At this time, an old voice came from high up in Celestial Seal sect. We all come from the same sect. Those who come are guests. These voices clearly reached everyone's ears. It was just a few simple sentences, but Zhang, he felt great admiration in his heart when he heard it. He didn't just keep his word, he was respectful. The last words were to warn all the people of Celestial Seal sect. Even in battle, they had to treat this youth from Yellow Heaven Daoist sect well. But the same words, in the ears of many people, meant that all restraints had been lifted. Feng Shuani of Celestial Seal sect seeks guidance from junior sect brother. A handsome young Celestial Seal sect disciple walked out of the crowd, bowed to this youth, and said slowly. The eyes of Murong Xiaoyi and many of the female disciples of Celestial Seal sect in the crowd lit up. This slender and handsome young Celestial Seal sect disciple was one of the people that Murong Xiaoyi had thought of just now. This person was handsome and had a high cultivation level. He was naturally favored by the junior and senior sisters of Celestial Seal sect. Feng Shuani would often become the topic of conversation for some female students before they went to bed. Zhang Yi looked at Feng Shuani's figure and felt the aura on his body. He also felt very envious. But at this time, the Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth responded. While I am young, I entered the sect at 5 years old. So I should be your senior sect brother. Do not mess up the seniority. When this youth from the Yellow Heaven Daoist sect said these words, he still had a dumb and clumsy appearance, as if he was seriously discussing the matter. He was like a farmer youth standing on the side of the road selling vegetables. In theory, he would sell a caddy of vegetables for as much as he could, making it impossible for others to get angry. So Feng Shuani found it amusing and said, Then you have the final say. You are the senior sect brother. This is not a matter of who has the final say. It is how it should be. This Yellow Heaven Daoist sect youth added, and then said solemnly to Feng Shuani, who was a head taller than him, You are the junior sect brother, so you can act. Feng Shuani shook his head. This did not mean that he was against it. He just felt helpless and could not reason with this person. So he smiled slightly and said, All right. His expression was at ease, and his emotions were relaxed. This meant that this cultivator had great confidence. Feng Shuani was the same at this time. When his smile faded and his gaze landed on the other youth, his gaze suddenly turned murderous. His sleeves shook, and a mountain of peach blossoms seemed to appear in front of him. He seemed to have gathered countless falling flowers from across time. Zhang Yi's eyes were wide. He was in disbelief. The pink brilliance shone on everyone's faces, turning them pink as well. But those were not truly tens of thousands of peach blossoms, but tens of thousands of little pink seals. Tens of thousands of seals appeared in front of Feng Shuani, like peach blossoms in a wild wind. Thinking that he could not even use 1 or 2 talismans well, Zhang Yi suddenly felt ashamed when he saw his senior martial brother casting tens of thousands of talismans at the same time. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.